The story begins with a terrible incident. A little boy who had been missing was found, but it was too late. People were horrified to find traces of a vampire bite on him, so they decided to use traditional methods to get rid of this innocent soul and bury him. Thoughts about a certain girl about whom bad rumors were circulating immediately began to creep into the minds of the villagers. While little Chris was being seen off, many adults were making their evil plans for Suha. It was no secret that after her appearance in the village, terrible things began to happen. But what happened before that? The action takes us back some time to when the guys were just starting to get to know each other. Chris questioned the girl, trying to understand if she really was a vampire. However, our heroine was not going to talk to him. She did not trust ordinary people. But the guy was persistent, so despite the girl's behavior, he extended his hand and introduced himself. The girl snorted and turned away again. The guy laughed, assuming her name was if she said that. The girl jumped up in bewilderment and introduced herself, and Chris only made sure that her name was Suha since he already knew it. The guy said that she was famous in the village, although they called her a recently moved vampire. Our heroine, of course, denied all these words and stated that she was not a vampire. But Chris analyzed and came to exactly this conclusion. He moves frequently, stays out of the light during the day, and walks alone at night. He suddenly assumed that she was catching and eating pigeons in the dead of night. The girl screamed again in bewilderment and said that it was all untrue, especially the part about the pigeons. Chris smiled and said he didn't believe it either. Our heroine, however, couldn't understand why such terrible rumors were circulating around her. The guy suddenly asked why she was giving these reasons herself, because she could come out and say that it was all a lie. But Suha tried, spoke, repeated the same thing many times. But even so, no one believed her and remained of the opinion that she had strange abilities. And yet, perhaps they were all right, because long ago as a child, she was told not to use her powers. The girl's parents did not want her to be suspected, so they asked her not to draw attention to herself. Suha was shocked by her parents' words, but they continued to tell her what to expect. If she accidentally revealed her powers to people, everyone would think she was a vampire. Suha was terrified of this and didn't want the rumors to be true. However, she was brought out of her thoughts by Chris, who stated that he believed that she was not a vampire. Suddenly, he also added one detail about himself, saying that he has been lame since birth. Our heroine didn't understand what he was talking about, so she asked again. The guy said with a smile on his face that it becomes scary to cross paths with people, thinking that you are different from them. Looking at her, he said that many people also gossiped about him, which meant that people in general were happy to talk about those who were different from them. Chris suddenly added that he even heard a conversation about how his parents would regret that he was born. But to tell the truth, the guy admitted that he was afraid that these words would come true. And yet now he was not afraid, because he knew that his parents loved him. So he did not listen to stupid conversations. Chris's smile radiated kindness and friendliness, which is exactly what he was aiming for. Extending his hand again, he invited the girl to be friends. Our heroine didn't know what to do because it was clearly unexpected. And yet the guy also stated that other guys don't take him to play and don't communicate with him. Suha extended her hand in response and agreed to the offer, and they began to communicate. From that very day, our heroine had her first real friend. For the first time, she could enjoy every day because she had a good man sharing it with her. The girl realized every day that for the first time she wanted to reveal her secret to someone. Soon, Chris's face spoke for itself because the guy was truly surprised. Our heroine was confused, assuming that all these were strange abilities. But Chris, even more perplexed and delighted, began to shout, saying that these were all cool abilities. Suha was surprised that he wasn't afraid that she might be a vampire. The guy smiled, saying that he was not afraid of her, because he knew her very well. Our heroine still couldn't believe it. So she asked again about 10 times, to which she heard a positive answer each time. And yet, in her mind, she knew that she was still afraid of the fact that she might be a vampire. Suddenly, Chris fell silent and soon turned to our heroine with a proposal. The guy suggested that she try to bite him on the neck. At that very moment, she screamed in horror, starting to list the terrible outcomes that could happen to him. But the guy still stuck to his guns. He trusted her, so he wanted to try. There was persistence and composure visible in his eyes, which is not the case with our heroine, who was immediately covered in sweat and horror. A shudder ran through her body. She repeated the worst that could happen to him, but Chris stood his ground, saying they could put it off until later when she believed he trusted her. With a smile on his face, he asked her to promise that she would bite him on the neck as soon as she believed in herself. It was at that very moment that our heroine realized that she had someone who believed in her more than she did. Meeting Chris was the greatest joy in our heroine's life. Her life was filled with meaning and happiness. Every evening, she listed what they could do, where to invite Chris, whether to come to him, but the fateful night changed all of our heroine's plans because at that moment, Chris's house was burning before her eyes. No one could help him. People screamed in horror, saying that the boy wouldn't be able to get out. Suha knew that she couldn't use her powers, but even so, she somehow ran forward without thinking about anything. She knew and remembered her parents' words that no outsider should know about her powers. The girl realized that people would begin to suspect her of all the troubles and would consider her a vampire. But despite all this, she continued to run, with the thought that Chris was okay. She didn't care what other people would say, and she didn't care what they would look at her. The girl threw aside all thoughts about her safety, knowing that such nonsense no longer bothered her. At that very moment, an explosion occurred in front of her, which blew the house into even smaller pieces. After quickly examining the surroundings, the girl was finally able to find him under the rubble. She immediately ran up and lifted a huge piece of the wall with her own hands. The boy was incredibly happy that Suha came to save him. With tears in his eyes, he declared that he believed her, despite all the empty talk of people. He felt that a person with such a warm heart couldn't be a vampire. Tears involuntarily flowed from our heroine's eyes, but his fate could not be avoided. During all this time, the girl realized that with him she had learned his worth and would never forget such a friend. Suddenly, the action moves to the distant future in one of the educational institutions. The woman who was accompanying the newly arrived student asked me to remind her name. The girl, her cold gaze staring into space, said only one word: Suha. The woman smiled and welcomed the student to Decellis Academy. This academy was unusual in that it had unusual rules in tribute to the founder. They work at night and classes, unlike regular academies, start at 9 p.m. The woman expected it might be difficult for her at first, but Suha seemed like the type who would quickly get used to everything. Suddenly, the teacher said that they had no rooms left in the dormitory, so they were forced to give her a room in the old building. The woman stated that no one had used the room, so it might be a mess, but our heroine wasn't particularly concerned about that. It seemed that she already knew all the main rules, but the teacher also added that it was forbidden to leave school after sunset. However, this was more for her personal safety than a mandatory rule. The reason for the leadership's worries was a murder that had taken place not far from here, and according to rumors, it was done by a vampire. The academy was known for its strict admissions process, meaning Suha was unlikely to encounter vampires within the campus walls. Right at that moment, our heroine raised her head and noticed a guy standing right in front of her. Just as suddenly, he apologized and moved on, turning his head away. Our heroine found him strange, which is why she continued to watch him for some time. However, soon the teacher and Suha continued walking deeper into the campus towards our heroine's room. But the guy, having walked some distance, stopped and turned to look at the stranger who interested him. Soon, the girls finally reached the door to our heroine's room. It was the last one and farthest from the other rooms, for which the teacher apologized. But for our heroine, it could even be said to be a good gift, which is why she declared that she liked it here. A few moments later, our heroine went inside, and the teacher wished her a good evening and went about her business. Suha immediately noticed the mess the teacher had told her about. It really was too dirty. The girl swallowed hard, not believing that this was really her room because she thought it was too cool for her. Suha started jumping for joy. The girl was incredibly worried and hoped that the teacher didn't notice, and yet she was over the moon. The school was the top high school in Riverfield, known for its strict anti-vampire policy. That's why the girl was more than sure that no one would think that she was a vampire. Because of her strange characteristics, she was constantly called a vampire throughout her life, so she moved from place to place every time. Despite the fact that the room required a general cleaning, our heroine took on the task with enthusiasm. And yet, at that moment, she stopped, realizing that all her abilities had really brought her nothing good. Remembering Chris's words, she knew that at least there was something in her life. But from now on, she would never again see such trust as from him. At that very moment, the old wooden door creaked with a loud, drawn-out sound, and in the passageway, the same guy was visible, his eyes wide in horror. Everything would be fine, except that our heroine was busy with urgent rearranging and was standing with a huge bed over her head. At that very moment, the guy said in shock that he had forgotten his book there. Our heroine immediately began screaming in horror, saying that he had misunderstood everything and hoped that he would be able to believe her. And yet, she knew that he, like everyone else, would not be able to believe her. Tears immediately welled up in her eyes. She didn't want her perfect place to be ruined so stupidly. Suha began to cry, insisting she wasn't a vampire. However, at that moment, the guy leaned over and with a smile on his face said that he knew she was not a vampire. Our heroine was in shock because despite all her thoughts, he said that he believed her. The guy explained that vampires couldn't get in here because their school had very strict rules for checking applicants. Moreover, just by looking at her face, you could tell how upset she was. Suha was over the moon that they believed her. The girl stated that anyone would feel that way, so she didn't want to be considered a vampire. Suddenly, Suha lowered her head, starting to remember the past next to Chris. Soon, she raised her gaze again and with a terrifying look said that she despised them more than anyone in the world. These words clearly echoed in the guy's head, because he even staggered back a little. Thanks to this educational institution, she could be calm and incredibly happy being here, safe from vampires. The guy was clearly confused by such an unexpected acquaintance and the girl's strange behavior, but he couldn't help but agree with her. Our heroine continued to radiate joy from the fact that no one would confuse her with a vampire here. A classmate laughed awkwardly, remarking that she seemed to have suffered enough. Wiping tears from her eyes, the girl said she couldn't even describe it. It was safe to say that she couldn't even count the number of times she had been bullied and made to look terrible, all because of those horrible vampires. And yet, according to her parents, before she was born, vampires were nothing more than a story in books. That is why the girl could not understand why and when everything went wrong. And yet she came to her senses. Saying that he came for the book, she offered him help in finding it. The guy smiled and said that he would do everything himself. But a moment later, he heard a surprised cry. Our heroine just discovered an old book, which immediately surprised her. The guy laughed awkwardly and scratched the back of his head, saying that he was a little interested in such old books. Suha suddenly assumed that this was precisely why he entered this academy. After all, this place is famous for its library with a collection of old publications. The guy was a little shocked by her hyperactivity, so he came to his senses in time and nodded his head. Our heroine smiled and declared that she too enjoys reading various types of literature. And yet, she decided to share the information that she didn't really have any friends at school, so all she could do was read. She was glad to see a man who read such books, so she immediately asked him what it was about. The guy looked down sheepishly and said that there were just old stories there. These words even interested our heroine, so she later asked to let her read this book. And yet, just a moment later, she cried out in surprise and turned her gaze to her classmate. The girl apologized for being too annoying because she was just glad to meet him. She also admitted that she hadn't communicated with people without prejudice for a long time. The guy smiled and asked her not to worry because he also really enjoyed chatting with her. In the blink of an eye, Suha turned red as a tomato and handed over the book asking him to take it. The guy took her in his arms, thanked her, and said goodbye, saying that it was time for him to go. Right at that moment, the door to the room slammed shut, and then our heroine realized that she had never asked his name and had forgotten to suggest meeting again. It was a great chance to make a friend, but in the end, she missed it because the guy left. But a moment later, the door clicked and began to open, letting in a bright light. Soon the stranger stood in the middle of the room again and said that he had forgotten the main thing: to ask the name of such a shy, sweet girl. And once again, our heroine was covered from head to toe in goosebumps and blushing, nervously starting to say whatever came into her head. Luckily, amidst all the verbal chaos, the guy managed to hear Suha's name, which made him unable to resist giving her a compliment. The girl nodded her head and continued to stare at one point, leaving an awkward silence in the room. Suddenly, the guy decided to ask her instead if she wanted to know his name. Suha started speaking abruptly again, saying that she really wanted to know this, which is why she asked the question directly. The guy laughed, saying that he had asked for it himself, but he would still tell his name. Looking into Suha's eyes, he said that his name was Heli, and he was a 12th grade student at Decellis Academy. Heli extended his hand and offered to become friends since they had something in common. Our heroine was shocked by the changes in her life today, which is why, in a slight shock, she was able to nod her head and agree to the offer. Waving his hand, he decided to say goodbye for today, saying that he would be glad to meet again sometime. Soon after these words, he smiled and closed the door, leaving Suha alone with her thoughts. Meanwhile, in the corridors of the academy, students were actively walking and chatting about upcoming classes. Heli walked in the same way, thinking about his own things, but suddenly his thoughts were interrupted by a loud and joyful cry from behind. It was Gino, who finally caught up with his classmate because he thought that he had completely disappeared somewhere. The guy laughed, saying they were planning to go home without him, but he still managed to show up in time. Heli smiled and apologized for his absence. The guy explained that he had stepped away for a moment to talk to a new student who had arrived today. A moment later, a puzzled guy who had heard about the new girl flew out from behind Gino. Heli said that it was indeed a girl, and she had settled into a room that no one else used. The guys were shocked because they immediately realized that we were talking about an old warehouse, which was very inconvenient. The fair-haired boy was perplexed because he really liked this place for solitude, but now he won't be able to go there. Haley reassured Cheyenne by suggesting that if they befriended the new girl, they would be able to visit there. A moment later, a perplexed Solon asked what kind of nonsense this was, since they weren't friends with people. They continued to communicate mentally. Heli said he introduced himself to the new girl and asked her to be friends, and that her name was Suha. A guy with silver hair interrupted their conversation, saying that Solon was indeed right, because for their own safety, they were not allowed to communicate with people. Solon nodded his head again and repeated the words that they did not need any extra problems. Heli understood his comrades' worries, but even so, he reassured them by stating that the newcomer was clearly unusual. The guy lowered his head and said that there was something in her that was similar to them, something that was different from a human. Cheyenne was almost speechless, and Gino asked in surprise how this girl managed to get here. Solon also intervened in the conversation, saying that there are no more like them, which means she is not one of them. Heli tried to explain herself, saying that she was not one of them, but at the same time, she was not an ordinary person. While going through his thoughts, the guy even declared that there was something attractive about her. Cheyenne started giggling, asking his brother if he really fell in love with the new girl after just talking to her for a couple of minutes. Solon still didn't understand where such emotions could come from. But even if they couldn't be friends with people. The silver-haired boy mentally agreed with Solon and stated bluntly that they would bring danger upon themselves by getting close to humans. And at that moment, Solon had already announced out loud to each of his comrades what they should remember for themselves. The guy loudly declared that they shouldn't get even a few meters closer to the new girl. But just then, Suha approached them. Naturally, Heli immediately noticed this, which is why he turned to her and tried to explain. Meanwhile, our heroine didn't even want to listen to them, because she understood that they already hated her. In her mind, she returned to her childhood, when all the children bullied her and avoided her. Knowing that she was a vampire, she wanted to start all over again here, but ended up facing her biggest nightmares again. Suha already clearly understood that just like the other children in the past, they would look at her in the same way here. And yet, she soon noticed Gino's strange gaze on her. The unfamiliar blonde guy looked at her in the same way. And then there was the guy with silver hair who did not take his eyes off her. Our heroine instantly became embarrassed, not understanding why they were looking at her so strangely. At that moment, Cheyenne extended his hand, saying that he had heard about her and assumed that she had just transferred today. The guy smiled as widely as he could and introduced himself, inviting the new girl to be his friend. While he nervously shook her hand, our heroine, no less nervously, decided to agree to this proposal. But a second later, Cheyenne was pushed away by a guy with red hair who said that Cheyenne was always nothing but trouble, so it was not worth being friends with him. Gino introduced himself and stated that the best solution for her would be to become friends with him. Cheyenne was furious with his comrade, but our heroine just nodded her head and said that she was very pleased. At this point, Jan also joined in, wiping his hand on his shirt and holding it out. Our heroine suddenly forgot about her thoughts, so she continued getting to know the friendly guys. John suddenly asked the girl not to worry about what Solon said about her, because they did not agree with him. He assumed it was natural for everyone to be friendly to the newcomer. Solon was simply shocked by the sudden deviation from their course. Our heroine was glad that her thoughts about what she heard were dispelled, which is why she lowered her head and thanked Jan for his support. Nevertheless, raising her head, she assumed that the guy with the disdainful gaze was Solon. She didn't like his wariness. Soon the guy simply snorted and turned away from the new girl, and our heroine became convinced that he didn't like her. She was sincerely sorry that this happened, but she still decided not to be upset, because she had another advantage. There were guys in front of her who were genuinely happy to see her, even though they seemed a bit cold at first. And more importantly, she realized that all these guys were Heli's friends, so it was a mystery to her what he told them about her. At that moment, Solon, perplexed, asked his comrades why they were all frozen. John, still looking at the newcomer, said he could go, and they would catch up. Solon was furious, and Heli decided to lighten the mood by asking the girl where she was going. Our heroine smiled and said she just wanted to look around the campus. The guy smiled and asked to let him give her a tour, and first they would show her where the library was. He decided to show this place because Suha had just told him that she loved to read. Cheyenne immediately jumped on the idea and asked to be taken along because he wanted to go too. Likewise, John and Gino said they would be happy to show us around the academy, which was surprising to our heroine. Solon was furious, realizing that they were all going to run around like a herd for some kind of inspection of the school. Cheyenne happily agreed, telling the guy he was right and didn't have to go. But Gino reassured his friend, suggesting he join them. Solon was against the idea. But after a while, all the guys were in the library, even the eternally dissatisfied Solon. At that moment, our heroine approached Heli, and with a smile on her face, asked him where he got the book he was reading. The guy immediately understood what she was talking about, reminding her that she was very old, which meant it was very difficult to get her without special permission. But anyway, he said that he would tell me what the book was about when he finished reading it. Our heroine was very pleased with this gesture, so she nodded in agreement and thanked him. Soon their tour continued, each telling everything they knew about this or that corner of the buildings. Suddenly, Cheyenne announced that he was also in 10th grade like her. He also decided to explain about the others. Gino and John were in 11th grade, but he decided to skip Solon. And finally, he pointed to Heli, saying that he was in the 12th grade. Our heroine was surprised that they were all in different classes and yet so close to each other. Heli smiled and said that this was indeed true, since they grew up together. Suha was in deep thought at that moment because she didn't understand how this could be, because she assumed that they couldn't be siblings. At that moment, Heli, as if reading her thoughts, said that they were all from the same orphanage, and their parents had died. The girl's expression changed at that moment, as she was clearly not ready to hear such a confession. Meanwhile, Solon was mentally screaming in despair, not understanding why Heli had told him everything. They soon approached the field, and Gino immediately announced that everyone was busy preparing for the upcoming nightball match. The remaining two were also there. Suha asked in surprise what that meant. To which Gino replied that they usually went in groups of 7. He also explained that those who are absent are now taking the game very seriously and cannot miss training. John nodded his head, saying that they love competition, so they train tirelessly, which is sometimes infuriating. He said this while simultaneously declaring that their team would still win. At this moment, our heroine wanted to ask another question but did not have time. At that very moment, John reacted sharply and waved his hand, causing our heroine to jump. Using the same reflexes, Helly, Cheyenne, and Gino protected the newcomer from the threat with their bodies. Looking at the ground, they realized that it was a ball that had clearly been very unlucky. A moment later, the guys who were playing apologized because the ball had gone the other way. John screamed in confusion and told Jaka and Noah that they should be more careful. After making sure that John had hit the ball, the boys apologized again and ran off to play again. The guy turned around and decided to make sure that Suha was safe after the surprise attack. Meanwhile, she stood hugging Helly, who, obviously due to his reflex, hugged the girl. A moment later, he jumped back and apologized, asking how she was feeling. Red as a tomato again, the girl said that she was grateful to them for spending their time and helping her today. Helly said that they all had a lot of fun, especially meeting the new girl. Soon after, our heroine turned around shyly and ran, saying that it was time for her to run. The boys were shocked why this happened, assuming that she was scared of the ball. After some time, our heroine, having completely exhausted her stamina, stood near the door and tried to catch her breath. It was very strange for her to realize that she had just almost died. But the fact that Helly just hugged her like that. Suddenly, Solan's puzzled voice was heard from behind, asking the new girl if she knew his name. Our heroine, in a slightly frightened voice, suggested that his name was Solon, because that's what the boys called him. He sighed heavily, turned around, and said that if she knew everything, then there was no point in talking. However, a moment later, our heroine stopped him and asked him to wait. The girl unexpectedly thanked him for that incident. Naturally, the guy, perplexed, asked what she was talking about. She recalled that on the sports field, when the ball flew in, it was he who grabbed her by the clothes and pulled her back. The guy screamed in shock and said that he didn't help her because there was dust on her uniform and he just shook it off. Our heroine decided that this was also quite sweet, so she thanked him anyway and decided to take a step towards him. She offered to be friends with him, but the guy interrupted her and advised her not to even think about getting close to them in the future. Suha, perplexed, asked why he was talking to her like that, to which the guy replied that they couldn't be friends with other people. Moreover, he said he was talking about people like her. These words caught the girl off guard, and yet Solon continued to look at the girl's puzzled face, which gave him a strange feeling. He felt an inexplicable strong attraction to her, but he still turned around and told her not to talk to them anymore. The action soon takes us to the next day. The boys were sitting in a circle, discussing important matters. A puzzled Cheyenne said that he understood the word Helly, because he too began to feel a strange attraction. Gino was just as sure of this, and although he knew that she was not one of them, there was some inexplicable feeling, as if a strange force was guiding his heart. John also stated in bewilderment that he agreed with his friends and did not know how to describe all of this. Helly suddenly suggested that they felt they wanted to do whatever she wanted. The boys unanimously agreed. Cheyenne was shocked. His heartbeat began to ring, but he couldn't believe it was love. Had they all fallen in love at the same time? Gino laughed and suggested that they couldn't possibly experience something like that. John agreed with his brother's statement, but also stated that he felt something else, much stronger than that. Meanwhile, our heroine was in tears and sniffling. Solon screamed in bewilderment and fear, starting to ask what happened to the girl's face. Suha hysterically said she understood him and wouldn't even say hello to them anymore. Solon, in a panic, asked them to say hello and forget about his words. He also shouted that she can talk a lot, and in general, she can do whatever she wants. Suddenly, he asked not to misunderstand him because he said that they would not get along, but not because he hated her. Now, with a certain feeling of regret, the guy said that all this was not so. And also, our heroine froze in anticipation of what Solon was about to say, but at that very moment, the guy sighed heavily and turned around, saying that although he had asked not to talk to him, the other guys would not listen to him. In any case, Solon advised not to focus on his words, and after that, said goodbye. Finally leaving the girl alone and starting to move away, the guy wished her goodnight. Our heroine was confused, and yet she waved Solon back and wished him goodnight. The very next day, the girl stood proudly near the closed door, because today was the first day at the academy. It was only at that very moment that she noticed Helly in front of her and was speechless. The guy immediately smiled and finally invited her to go to class together. Our heroine was shocked, but the guy said that they had become friends and he wanted to take her on a trip. The girl was surprised that he cared enough to make sure she didn't feel uncomfortable after the transfer. In her eyes, he was a very good person. Soon they were passing through a corridor where every passerby greeted Helly, while our heroine walked beside him, embarrassed and silent. The girl was clearly surprised that this guy was so popular within the academy. Although, looking at him, she couldn't help but agree with this, because he was very cool and friendly to everyone. That's why she decided that she was not special, and that Helly was polite and friendly with others. At that moment, the guy noticed the blushing girl and decided to assume that she was uncomfortable around him. Our heroine immediately jumped up, saying that this was not true, and moreover, it was not because of him that she was like this. Suha even decided to state that she felt that they would be uncomfortable because of her. She understood that they had all been a close group since childhood. So who would like it if someone else intruded into their company? These words surprised Helly so much that he declared it nonsense because it wasn't true at all. He immediately assumed that Solon had spoken these nonsense to her. Our heroine cried out in bewilderment and said that it wasn't him, but she couldn't figure out in her head how he had guessed. Nevertheless, Healy told the new girl that the guy didn't say those words out of malice, so there was no need to be offended by him. Moreover, at that moment, Helly said that the reason for Solon's words was not at all in her. At that very moment, our heroine remembered how strange Solon had behaved yesterday. Suddenly, Helly mentally told the girl that they had a secret, which almost made our heroine faint. She was perplexed, trying to understand what had just happened and whether she had understood correctly that he was in her head. Helly nodded his head and continued speaking through his thoughts, saying that it was telepathy. Then the guy told the girl that he told only her about this secret because he trusted her. Soon after, he decided to wish Suha a good day and good luck in her lessons out loud. Our heroine didn't immediately come to her senses, which is why she wished him luck in a slightly confused voice before turning around and heading to room 101. It was in this very room that Suha was already waiting for Cheyenne, who was incredibly happy to see a girl in the same class. The girl was also very happy that she was in the same class with Cheyenne. Soon, the guy happily extended his arms and pointed to the place next to him, inviting her to sit next to him. Our heroine wanted to say that this place was already taken, but the guy happily nodded his head and said that everything was fine. He suddenly announced that Solon could be told to sit somewhere else. Our heroine immediately felt goosebumps, especially when she sensed someone behind her. Slowly turning her head, she noticed the puzzled face of Solon, who had heard their entire conversation. Our heroine, in instant horror, told him that she could find another place, but he had to stay in his own. But Solon only sighed heavily and said that he would change seats. It's true that soon after the lesson began, he couldn't help but create tension with his presence behind Suha. After some time, the lessons were finally over. Getting up from his seat, Gino decided to ask what they were going to do next. Our heroine, after thinking a little, said that she was going to clean the room. Although she managed to settle in with great difficulty, she was unable to thoroughly clean out the place because there was a lot of stuff that needed to be thrown out. The guy immediately reacted to these words and offered his help. A few moments later, our heroine finally walked out into the corridor like the majority of the students. Suddenly, a voice echoed in her head, calling her from somewhere behind her, causing her to almost jump. Turning her head, she immediately realized that it was Helly, who had come to inquire about her condition after the first day. Our heroine laughed and said that she felt at ease because she was in the same class as Xian. Helly naturally assumed that if she was in the same class as Xian, then Solon was also in their class. Sua happily replied that she was sitting next to him, and what's more, he gave up his seat to her. Hearing the words about this incredible act of Solon, Helly almost fell over, because this was not like the Solon he knew. At that very moment, a guy came up and said that he hadn't given up this place, it had simply been taken away. John interrupted their conversation and, with a puzzled expression on his face, declared that he should have given up this seat. Gino also nodded his head and reminded them that Suha was new and they should keep an eye on her. Cheyenne summed up the words spoken by telling his brother that if he didn't like something, he could sit at the back of the class. The guy was simply furious at everything that was said about him. Our heroine at this moment announced that she wanted to do some cleaning and Cheyenne agreed to help her. Helly leaned towards her and telepathically asked if he could come with them. Our heroine lowered her head in embarrassment and said that Helly could come to her. At that moment, Solon became even more tense, as strange thoughts crept into his head. In any case, after a couple of moments, all the guys were in Suha's room and immediately started cleaning, which was a little awkward. John wiped the sweat from his face and asked the girl to just stand aside and breathe air. Gino also smiled and said that they would handle everything. Cheyenne even told the new girl that he loves cleaning more than anything in the world. While Solon was shouting in bewilderment and saying that it was all a lie, our heroine was shocked and said that she wanted to help. Bending down, she decided to take out one of the boxes that were covered with a rag. John, horrified, caught himself and told her not to even think about it, because there was something in that box. Our heroine jumped up abruptly with the box in her hands and asked why he was scaring her so much. Only when she lowered her gaze did she realize that it was sports equipment. While our heroine lost her soul, which went off in an unknown direction, John, shocked, said that there were 100-kilogram dumbbells here. An awkward pause instantly filled the room, which seemed to have no intention of ending. Just at that moment, Helly approached Suha and asked her to give him the box. Telepathically, he told her that everything was fine, because he also had this ability. Helly asked in surprise if she was afraid of him, or if perhaps she had already begun to hate him. Our heroine began to shake her head in horror and say that she would never have thought such a thing. At that moment, Solon's fears were confirmed. causing him to scream in horror, wondering if Helly was really using telepathy. Gino, like everyone else in the room, held their breath for a moment. But the guy smiled calmly and said that it was true and he had been doing this for a while now. The brothers wanted to tell him something, but he simply turned his head and asked Suha if she could keep his secret. The girl screamed in horror and said that she would under no circumstances tell anyone about this. Helly smiled, thanked her, and suggested that they keep it all between them, stating that she had a very cool power. Our heroine immediately screamed, saying that he also has cool abilities because she was initially surprised. But still, telepathy, in her opinion, is cool. Suddenly, Cheyenne appeared next to her, hanging from the ceiling. Our heroine jumped in alarm, and the boy happily declared he could walk on walls. Solon was shocked. He knew that Helly was a fool, but if even Xion could do something like that. Suddenly, John grabbed 2 dumbbells and lifted them with just his fingers, declaring that he was there to work out with them. Gino came up next and said that if her hands got cold, he would help her warm up. With a heavy sigh, Solon realized that there was no point in him fighting this battle. And yet, the guy noticed a look on himself that was clearly expecting something, which is why he immediately shouted, saying that he didn't know how to do anything. Suha was surprised and sighed, saying that there was nothing wrong with it and that she understood everything. The guy instantly blushed and admitted he did have some knowledge, but he just wouldn't show it. Our heroine was surprised, causing her to nod. The guy immediately headed for the door, telling his brothers that if they were finished cleaning, then it was time for them to go. A couple of seconds later, Solon came out and stood right next to the door, hearing the brothers' laughter from inside. At this point, Helly smiled and agreed that it was time for them to go. So he said goodnight to Suha. Our heroine smiled and expressed her gratitude to them for their help today. All the guys went out the door and said goodbye to Suha one last time, wishing to see her tomorrow as soon as possible. A moment later, the door slammed shut, and our heroine was left alone with her thoughts. She felt incredibly good at heart because she was able to meet wonderful guys. But more importantly, she was surprised that there were people with the same abilities in this place, which meant she wasn't the only one. At that moment, the girl wondered if the students thought the same thing about her when they saw her. It soon dawned on her that she had been bullied all her life because of this misunderstanding. She knew that she would not act like the people who humiliated her. But what was more important to her was that Helly was the first person after Chris who believed her. And she, in turn, was in such a mood that she believed him and wanted to trust them all. Suha was absolutely sure that if there were people like her in the world, then there were people like Helly and his friends. That is why the girl now knew for sure that she was not alone and that she had good friends. The action soon moves forward a short time when the moon has risen over Decilis Academy. During this quiet hour, unknown guys jumped over the fence into the territory and landed deftly on the ground. One of them said in bewilderment that it smelled too bad here, so he wanted to find the disgusting vampires as soon as possible. At this time, our heroine was proud of herself and the guys, because thanks to their help, the room instantly became cleaner. But she forgot to do one thing. At the end, Suha forgot to ask the guys to take the trash with them, which means she has to do it herself. After some time, the girl left her building and walked along a lonely path to the trash cans. Soon, the girl caught herself thinking that the path to the trash bin looked much darker than she thought, and much further. Classes started at 9 in the evening and ended around 2 in the morning, so it was already 3 o'clock when I took a little break. Suddenly, the teacher's words appeared in our heroine's thoughts, saying that a murder had taken place not far from here. She remembered that it was the work of a vampire, but she couldn't understand why she thought about it now. Suha found herself thinking that she would like to tell all those who call her a vampire that she is afraid of them herself. Quickly running to the trash can, she decided to throw out the trash and just as quickly leave. But at that very moment, she felt someone's presence behind her, which made her horrified. At that very moment, she reacted with lightning speed and grabbed the stranger by the hand, throwing him over herself. The guy fell to the ground with a huge crash. And what's more, the ground underneath him completely cracked. Our heroine, terrified, tried to catch her breath, asking if a vampire had really attacked her. While the boy was groaning and saying how much his back hurt, Suha suddenly noticed that he was wearing a school uniform. A moment later, this guy's acquaintances, who called him Khan, started running towards the roar. The guy started to bare his fangs, shocked that some asshole dared to touch Khan. True. At that very second, our heroine turned around and showed her cold-blooded face. The guy didn't even have time to come to his senses before he received a very deft blow to the ribs. Najak literally instantly twisted and fell to the ground from incredible pain in his stomach. The purple-haired guy who came up last was shocked by the girl he saw in front of him. Suha didn't even give him a chance to say anything, starting to say that she would be the first to know who they were. Assuming they were vampires, the horrified boy began to tell her to take back her words. Suddenly, another guy came up and asked Tahel not to mislead the stranger. Enzi arrived, shook his finger from side to side, and said that for them there was no worse insult than a vampire. A moment later, Najak jumped up from the ground, saying that he would never tolerate such accusations. A moment later, Khan stood behind our heroine again as if life had taught him nothing, but he also noticed that they all despised vampires. Soon the guys finally decided to talk calmly, and our heroine was able to introduce herself and apologize for what happened. She was very scared last night, but the guys apologized for scaring her. At that moment, Najak also decided to join in the repentance and ask for forgiveness for running up so suddenly. Tahel then joined the conversation, saying that Khan and Najak were pretty strong guys, but there was no need to be afraid of them. And of course, Enzi introduced himself at the end, apologizing once again for such an intrusion, just in case. Our heroine, looking at the guys who were asking her for forgiveness, was a little confused. Suha understood that usually in such situations she was mistaken for a vampire, but they communicated with her as if nothing had happened. At that moment, the girl glanced at Khan and started a conversation with him. She suggested that his uniform wasn't from their school. Khan didn't even have time to answer, because Najak intervened in the conversation and said that they were students of Sunshine City School. Tahel, with a smile on his face, supported his friend's words, saying that they came here to find some freaks. Suddenly, his words were interrupted by Jaka and Noah, who came to the aid of the new girl, asking the seniors what they were doing there. Tahel immediately became very tense, saying that it would be better for them not to get involved in adult conversations. Only Enzi decided to calm his comrade down, telling him that he should be calmer. Khan interrupted the conversation, stating that they were investigating a murder that had occurred the other day. Looking coldly at the students of Decelis Academy, Khan said that a student from their school had died. At that very moment, our heroine realized what was happening and drew parallels with the teacher's words. Noah, somehow surprised and cold-blooded, asked what this situation had to do with them. Tahel was losing his mind and control more and more, as he was shocked that they considered themselves separate from this situation. The guys decided to have a laugh by telling the Sunshine City students that all the murders were more their thing. After these words, all the students of Sunshine City tensed up, wanting to hear that they regretted the words they had spoken. Noah also began to charge, assuming that they came here under such a bright moon, because on normal days they couldn't even hold a candle to them. A moment later, Najak lost control and began swinging. Noah also decided to resist the evil that came to his land, so he gathered energy and made a dash. It was a really loud female scream, and Suha, who stood between them, was able to stop the fight. She screamed even louder, ordering them to stop this stupid squabble because she did not want to see any fights. Najak was in shock because his body did not move, no matter how great his desire to tear the stupid vampire apart. At this point, Noah was horrified that the girl had stopped him with just words. He had no idea where she got such strength from. Jaka suddenly said in an embarrassed voice that he and Noah thought that these guys were bullying her. Our heroine screamed and said that wasn't true. There had been a misunderstanding between them, meaning she was asking them to stop arguing. At that very moment, the boys felt some kind of incomprehensible and strange energy that seemed to control their bodies. In any case, their conversation was soon interrupted by another voice, which clearly did not understand what they were all doing there at such a late hour. There was no point in guessing, knowing that Heli had also decided to join the meeting. The students from Sunshine City Academy immediately tensed up, as they had met him many times before. Our heroine saw his gaze and knew that it clearly did not bode well. At that moment, Heli seemed to go mad. His gaze changed, his voice more commanding. He ordered the hooligans to get away from Suha. There was a distinct scent of mutual hostility in the air right now as the two opposing campaigns met. Suha immediately tried to explain that she had just gone out to throw out the trash and they had had a small misunderstanding. Coming a little closer, he asked if she was hurt, to which the girl said in surprise that everything was fine. Soon he took her by the shoulder, saying that it was already late and dangerous here, so it was time to leave and he would take her to the room. However, it wasn't so easy to leave, as a perplexed Khan asked Heli why he had decided to just turn around when they hadn't finished anything. Heli turned around and calmly replied that he had nothing to talk about with them, so he told them to get out of their school. But Khan continued to speak, suggesting that their student's death was their doing. Heli stated that this was not so, but Najak cried out in bewilderment and said that this false word was not enough to be justified. Jaka joined the conversation and said that they don't do that kind of thing. Tahel asked how they would prove all this, to which Noah said in surprise that they were asking the same question to them. Khan looked at the boys in bewilderment and asked if they really thought they had come here for no reason. Suddenly, Heli spoke again, a smirk evident in his voice as he said what would happen if it was their doing. At that moment, an incredible aura emanated from Heli, truly frightening. The boy, his eyes blank, asked Sunshine City what they would do about it. Tahel instantly decided that it was because of them that their student died, which is why he decided to go on the attack. Heli was not going to stand aside, so he immediately reacted and began preparing for an attack. Only at that very moment he was stopped by Suha, who was in tears. The girl, with shock in her eyes, yelled first at Heli and then at Tahel, ordering them to stop their stupid squabbles. To her surprise, both Tahel and Heli heard her and instantly stopped, ending the war that had not yet begun. Heli even sheepishly apologized and said that they would not fight anymore because he did not want to make her worry. Soon after, the guy raised his head and turned to Khan and said that he understood why they suspected them. However, he admitted that at the moment he is speaking with the utmost sincerity, and he says that it was not them, and he hoped for their trust. While Khan was thinking about what to say, Tahel shouted in bewilderment and asked if he was really going to take them at their word. In turn, Heli stated that he did not want to quarrel with them right now, because Suha was already scared. The students of Sunshine City Academy looked at their opponents with devastated expressions, as if they were trying to achieve someone's leadership. After reading these thoughts, Heli reminded them that there would soon be a nightball competition, so he suggested that they settle everything on the field. By doing this, he wanted to resolve their current situation not with his fists, but through sports. In any case, even this scenario didn't make them particularly happy, but Khan still decided to turn to Suha. The guy said that they would leave today, and he was sorry that they scared her. However, Khan decided to point out that this incident and Nightball are not connected in any way. That's why Khan and his company advised against acting rashly, because they would be keeping an eye on them. But even so, the guy decided to warn them that in the game they would grind them into dust. Heli couldn't help but laugh after hearing this, so he smiled and said that they would be very careful. Khan turned and headed for the exit, telling the others to follow him. A puzzled Tahel could be heard for some time as he and the rest of the guys from Sunshine City left the meeting place. Najak was also unhappy that Decellis Academy thought they could win at Nightball this year, but they had different guys coming back this year. While Najak and the others thought they could win, Enzi was caught up in his thoughts. At this point, Heli approached Suha and invited her to go with him. Naturally, the girl was only too happy about it. After a while, the guys walked in a rather awkward silence, which made our heroine feel uncomfortable. But luckily for her, she heard at least a voice. Suddenly, Heli apologized to the girl. The guy apologized to Suha for almost getting into a fight right in front of her. Our heroine smiled and said that everything was fine, because he stopped when she told him to stop. Heli smiled and proudly confirmed that he had done just that. Suha smiled back and said that made everything okay. After some time, the guys finally returned to the illuminated area, and our heroine was still thinking about what had happened. Even though Heli hadn't done anything, she instinctively felt that she had to stop him. Otherwise, she had a feeling that something terrible might happen. One way or another, the action moves to a slightly different part of the academy. Just above the bright moonlight stood Solon, stretching his hand to the heavens. It was the moonlight that awakened in him that very energy and his secret powers that he did not show. The guy was proud that he was finally achieving what he had been waiting for so long, but right at that moment, he heard a puzzled voice behind him, which was clearly surprised that Solon was a werewolf. The guy was confused and turned around as quickly as possible. Enzi claimed they'd met before, but he was introducing himself to him for the first time. Enzi extended his hand and introduced himself, saying that he was also a werewolf. But looking at Solon, he declared that, unlike him, he was not a half-breed. One way or another, Solon, with horror in his voice, began to deny it, saying that he was clearly not like them. Enzi, for his part, believed that there was no point in hiding anything when he had seen everything, but he was still more interested in how this was possible. The guy couldn't help but admit that he was impressed, because Solon was half vampire, half werewolf. Every person, especially they, knew one historical truth, that they were born to be enemies at the instinctive level. Enzi asked in surprise how such a thing could have happened, to which Solon responded sarcastically, asking why on earth he should tell him anything at all. The guy spread his arms out to the sides, saying that this was also true, since he didn't know him anything. With a smile on his face, the guy said that if Solon didn't want to talk, then he shouldn't talk, because he was just curious. Solon immediately shouted, asking what he was doing on their team, especially at a time like this. Enzi smiled calmly once again and said that they just came to ask a few questions for them. He was more than sure that Solon had heard about the murder that had taken place the other day. Once again, the guy said that a student from their academy had died, and bite marks were clearly visible on his neck. Solon began to lose his temper, asking in bewilderment why the hell they decided that this was their doing. Enzi laughed awkwardly, deciding to remind them that they were the only ones in their area who were vampires. The guy wasn't going to deny their feud, but he was more than sure that they were far from angels either. Solon especially decided to emphasize his words by the fact that they came to him on the eve of the day of the full moon. At this point, Enzi defended himself by saying that everything was correct, because under the bright light of the moon, they too felt a strong urge to give in to their own innate instincts. But at the same time, the guy clearly clarified that they had never caused nonsense to ordinary people and had no intention of doing so. Solon responded to this proudly by stating that they were exactly the same and different from others like them. And moreover, to be more precise, from their point of view, it is rather they who are different from them. Enzi was truly surprised why they only do what others think. Solon ignored Enzi's question, remembering that he had asked him how he might be of mixed blood. The guy replied that he wouldn't be able to answer his question today, but not because he didn't want to. The reason was that he himself had no idea what he was. But most importantly, this concerned not only him, but all of them. Solon spoke in bewilderment about how they seemed to have been artificially created somewhere, as if they had woken up from a long sleep. These words suddenly overtook Enzi, leaving him speechless and at a loss of words. In any case, Solon stated that it was not their doing and they did not kill anyone. He also added that people will think that they and those creatures are of the same origin, but they do not believe that they are related to them. Everything Solon said right now, Enzi just listened and said nothing, showing his indifference. The guy snorted and said that if they didn't want to believe, then they didn't have to, because he wasn't looking for understanding from them. Enzi suddenly nodded his head and said that, frankly, he also hoped that they were not lying. Soon he extended his hand, saying that they were at least half of the same blood. Solon clearly didn't expect this outcome, which is why his eyes darted from side to side and his voice began to tremble. But his salvation came from Enzi's friends, who were just looking for him to leave. The guy immediately lowered his hand and said that it was time for him to go. But the next time they met, he hoped to at least say hello to Solon. Enzi calmly said goodbye to Solon and left him alone with his shock. Meanwhile, Heli and the guys had just escorted Suha to the door, for which she was grateful. He hoped that from now on they would go out to throw out the trash together, especially at such a late hour. Our heroine laughed and agreed with him, because she also didn't want to get into a similar situation again. The guys were about to leave when our heroine suddenly remembered something, because there was something else she wanted to discuss. Looking at the boys, she decided to clarify that their names were Noah and Jaka. The boys stared at her in surprise. In any case, Suha thanked them for showing up at the right moment when they heard the noise and came to help. Noah by this time still hadn't fully recovered from what had happened on the street, which is why his speech was slow, but he nodded his head. Soon the girl turned her head and asked Heli in surprise why he came there so late. The guy smiled and said that he just happened to be there while passing by. Our heroine was incredibly grateful to him, because without him they couldn't have managed, and also... Suddenly the girl fell silent. The guy asked in surprise what happened, to which Suha leaned over sharply and said goodnight, saying that everything was fine. Our heroine was red as a tomato once again, and all because she almost let it slip to him that she was glad he came. Anyway, she also turned to the boys and thanked them again, wishing them goodnight. Still just as slow and not understanding what was happening, Noah and Jaka nodded their heads. Soon after, Heli leaned over to her and wished her sweet dreams as well. In the blink of an eye, our heroine became even redder, causing her to become instantly confused. A couple of seconds later, she quickly opened her door, rushed inside and locked it from the inside. After that, the guys were finally left alone, and Noah and Jaka's intent gazes never left Heli. With one voice, they instantly pounced on him and asked who this girl was. Heli calmly told them her name was Suha and that she had recently transferred. He was surprised they hadn't met her yet. Noah telepathically asked who this girl was and also stated that she was not an ordinary person. The guy suddenly started telling the story of what happened when they were walking home from nightball practice. A sudden impulse flashed through their minds and their thoughts instantly dissolved. The boys felt the wave's suspicious strength and decided to go to their source. What surprised them was that Suha was there, alone against the Sunshine City students. But the most important thing for them was that they had never felt anything like this before. For Noah, it was terrifying only because all that power consumed him. Jaka nodded, saying that when they tried to attack those flea-bitten ones, the girl stopped them. They couldn't move from their spot just because of her few words, as if they were mesmerized by her power. This whole situation made Noah think that this girl was clearly not from their society. Heli sighed heavily and said that it was all ambiguous, because according to her, what she hated most in this world were vampires. At this time, our heroine was in the room and thinking about the situation that had happened. She clearly remembered Khan's words, who was confident in the reasons why they came here to investigate. Either way, she had no idea why he said those exact words, looking at Heli and the other guys. She was even afraid to imagine that the bright and cheerful guys she knew had anything to do with that incident. However, after some time, rumors of werewolf incursions reached the other boys. John was in incredible shock. Heli nodded his head, saying that the victim of the murder case went to their school and that is why they blamed them for what happened. John was beside himself with anger because he couldn't even think that they could be falsely accused so easily. A second later, the door opened and a bewildered Solon stood in the middle of the passage. The guy, perplexed, asked why they had all gathered and, moreover, why they had chosen his room for this. John happily informed him that Suha now lived where they were meeting, so they would now meet at his house. Gino also added that his room is cleaner than theirs and is located in the center. The guy shouted in confusion, reminding them that Cheyon's room was also in the center, so he told them to gather there. Cheyon responded by saying that he didn't want that because they would make a mess and he would have to clean up. Solon, even more shocked, reminded him that when they were gathering at Suha, he was one of the first to say that he loved cleaning. Anyway, Noah interrupted them and told Solon that werewolves had recently raided their school. The guy instantly came to his senses, as if he remembered that he wanted to say something. John was very surprised by this reaction, which is why he assumed that he knew this, but could not understand where from. The guy instantly became scared and began to get lost in his words while trying to say something. Solon couldn't think of anything better than the fact that there was a terrible smell going around the school, and he sensed something was wrong. Turning away, he said through clenched teeth that he hated werewolves because they were wild and disgusting. But Helly turned to him and asked him not to overdo it, because it seemed they were not confident in their words. Noah was completely perplexed by the idea that they were incapable of killing people. He couldn't understand why they thought they were the ones doing it. Gino suddenly said that recently there had been a rumor circulating that this was the work of vampires. As people say, all the blood had disappeared from the victim's body, and there were bite marks on the neck. In that case, he also decided that it was logical for them to assume that the vampire had tried. In recent days, cases of vampire attacks have become more frequent, so no one is surprised by this anymore. Jaka wanted to object, starting to talk about how they only drink blood. Suddenly, he was interrupted. John said that they all remember that fateful day when something irreparable happened. Helly decided to sum it up by saying that even if they did nothing and they knew it, he wanted to complete the main task for now. At this time, Suha was lying in her room, still tormented by questions and doubts. This is exactly what the guy wanted to avoid. So he was going to tell the whole truth. Solon cried out in bewilderment, telling his brothers that they had already done enough things for doubts to creep in, which was why he had told them not to get close to her. The guy was shocked that they all voluntarily showed their abilities. At that moment, Noah almost fainted when he learned that all the guys had managed to show their strength. Turning to them, he shouted and asked if it was true, to which everyone else turned their heads in confusion. Solon nodded his head and said that they were all going crazy, but he didn't show her anything and was proud of himself. Suddenly, Jaka stated that Solon hadn't even shown them anything, which immediately made the guy confused. The guys decided to raise this issue, so they asked him directly what powers he had. John suddenly said that Solon might actually be a completely ordinary person among them all. Cheyenne came up with the perfect idea when he said that they should bite him in that case and everything would fall into place. At this point, Solon began to get more and more angry, saying that everything was not as it seemed. Cheyenne smiled again and said that he knew and was only joking because he believed his brother. He knew for sure that his ability was to grumble like no one else in the whole world, and that it was a very powerful force. Helly laughed and asked Cheyenne to stop, reminding him that he didn't want any misunderstandings with Suha, especially in a negative way. Gino nodded his head and agreed with this, because no matter what, not everyone remembers that she hates vampires. John even felt pain and fear from these thoughts because he would not want her to hate them. Solon suddenly shouted and told the brothers that they should be careful and not talk to her unnecessarily. But more importantly, he asked them not to show that they were close, so greetings alone would be enough. Noah agreed with Solon, especially that the brothers were acting too carefree. Jaka also agreed with the brothers and advised them to be more careful in the future. Finally, the guys unanimously declared that they realized their mistakes and would be careful in the future. It's true that after some time, Xian met Suha and suddenly invited her to go for a walk on the weekend. Solon was shocked by what he just heard, causing him to almost hit Cheyenne on the head. Our heroine was embarrassed because it was quite unexpected, but nevertheless she asked where he wanted to go. Cheyenne was beaming with happiness when he was around Suha. The guy suggested they go to the main square and get some ice cream. He also planned to take her to the beach next. Suha was surprised by the sudden proposal, but she liked their plan nonetheless. The girl suddenly asked if she understood correctly that it would be just the two of them. Cheyenne happily said that they would be alone, when suddenly Solon shouted, declaring that he would go too. The guy looked at Solon in anger and telepathically asked why he was suddenly interrupting their conversations. Solon replied that he had no idea what Cheyenne would think of saying to her when they were alone. The guys started a verbal altercation via telepathy, but our heroine had no idea what was going on. Solon shouted again in anger, reminding her that they had already decided not to get close to her. Cheyenne made the cutest expression and said that he said that on purpose at that moment, and silly Solon believed him. The guy was simply beside himself with anger and the fact that his brothers still do whatever they want. Within a moment, Solon shouted and telepathically called all the brothers, declaring that Cheyenne and Suha would go to the main square together. The boy shouted at his brother in bewilderment, asking why he did this, because he wanted to keep it a secret. However, Solon ignored his words and hoped that the brothers would put Cheyenne and his desires in their place. But the truth is that a moment later, John, Gino, Noah, and also Jaka announced that they would also go to the square. Solon understood that this was a failure and he simply did not have any more strength. But Cheyenne was angry at his brother, saying that he had ruined his date. Suddenly, Helly personally approached our heroine, asking if it was true that she was going to the main square. Of course, Suha confirmed these words, to which the guy also asked to go with her. The girl was only happy with this offer, which is why she blushed at the moment and agreed. At that very moment, the guy leaned over her ear and whispered that they would see each other on the weekend. After some time, our heroine was standing in the middle of the square, and her expression spoke of her surprise. A joyful Cheyenne ran towards her, surprised that Suha had arrived earlier than him, when he had planned to be even earlier. Our heroine said hello, but still wondered where the others had gone. The guy scratched his head and said the others had told him they were very busy. Cheyenne said his brothers couldn't keep their word and suggested they spend time together. He was going to show her the square. Suha nodded her head and agreed, assuming that Helly was simply busy and didn't come. Cheyenne knew a great place to get ice cream, so he decided to offer to go get it. Our heroine didn't mind, and yet, even so, her thoughts were preoccupied with Helly. She didn't know what important thing could have happened to him, so she figured she should ask, and she immediately removed these thoughts from her head, deciding that she would only distract him in vain because he was busy, and therefore there was no point in imposing herself on him, but she still knew that he could have warned her in advance. At that moment, the guys approached their destination, and Xian offered Suha to choose the ice cream that she liked. Our heroine, a little confused, said that she wanted vanilla ice cream. While the guy ordered a mountain of vanilla ice cream, Suha thought about how telepathy was impossible to use on her part. It was strange that she could only use it when Helly started. And again, she began to distract herself from all sorts of different thoughts by deciding that she could simply contact him by phone. At that moment, Xian called her and held out a delicious ice cream especially for her. The guy, with a smile on his face, said that he asked her to do as much as possible for her. Our heroine had never seen such huge horns in her life, which left her in shock. After a while, the guys were sitting on a bench and eating ice cream, assuming that they were having a really good time together. Suddenly, while Cheyenne was eating his ice cream, he was contacted telepathically. Screams immediately followed. John was furious. They agreed to meet at 7 p.m., but by 5 o'clock, he had already disappeared somewhere. Cheyenne sighed in bewilderment and asked when he had ever said such nonsense, since they had agreed on 5 o'clock. The guy consoled his brothers by saying that they all managed to screw up with the timing and only he arrived on time. Solon was even more angry than anyone else, so he yelled and told Cheyenne not to even think about leaving them. The guy snorted and telepathically challenged Solon to come. He suddenly added that they would be riding in a boat with Suha, so they could try to find them in the sea. Solon was still shouting something, but Cheyenne was no longer listening, because he suddenly began to hum a cheerful melody. Suddenly, our heroine turned to him and decided to interrupt him from his business. The girl thanked him and also reminded him that the others had urgent matters to attend to, so she decided that he was probably busy too and came to meet her anyway. The guy instantly turned into a tomato and started saying that he was just very caring. Suddenly, our heroine also decided to confess that this was her first time walking in the square. Cheyenne almost fell off his seat because his shock was very difficult to describe. Suha even turned a little pale at that moment, because there was a reason behind all this. Namely, that crowded places frighten her. The guy looked at Suha and saw the obvious pain inside her, which is why he needed to act quickly. Instantly catching himself, he invited her to go for a boat ride together. He decided that if she didn't like large crowds of people, then they could stay by the sea until sunset. The guy immediately turned around and announced he'd quickly buy tickets and come back. Our heroine didn't have time to say anything, just nodded after him. Thus, the girl was left alone with her delicious vanilla ice cream. Suddenly, a voice she couldn't mistake for anyone else's addressed her. It was calling her. Of course, it was Helly who asked Suha where she was now. Without thinking twice, our heroine stated that she was alone in the square and also decided to find out if he had any urgent business today. The guy immediately replied that he had something to do. Perhaps not the most urgent, but it was important. Our heroine was surprised by this answer, and her interest took over, which is why she immediately asked what he was doing. Helly answered her calmly. All he had to do was meet her. Hearing these words, our heroine instantly felt goosebumps. Suha became so hot that she had to snack on ice cream while asking Helly not to scare her like that and not to joke. But the guy responded by declaring it was no joke. He quickly apologized for being late for such an important meeting, but he'd be right there. The girl, looking down in embarrassment, said that she would wait. But she herself thought that her thoughts were limited to the fact that he would not come. Suddenly, the girl jumped up with the thought that she needed to warn Cheyenne not to buy boat tickets, because Helly would be arriving soon. Suha ran around the corner and headed towards the ticket kiosk, assuming it was that way. Still, she decided that it would be best for them to buy another ticket, then everyone would be happy. At that very moment, a hand flew out of nowhere and rushed towards Suha. The girl didn't even have time to scream before she instantly flew off into a dark alley. Her ice cream suddenly fell to the ground, and the kidnapper slowly pulled the girl back and continued to cover her mouth with his hand. Our heroine looked up and was horrified by what she saw in front of her. Not understanding what the hell was going on or why this monster had red pupils, she deftly twisted and knocked him to the ground with a crash. Soon, our heroine was able to catch her breath and also realized that this monster was actually a human. And yet something was wrong because an ordinary person does not have such sharp claws. Literally, at that very moment, our heroine began to put things together and her power of speech was simply lost. She instantly realized that in fact everything was not as simple as it seemed, and at the same time, the monster began to rise to its feet. The monster spun around, revealing its sharp fangs in all their glory. Its eyes were filled with a thirst for one thing: blood. Only because of this did our heroine realize that in front of her stood a real vampire, who was even more angry at her than before. Seeing a real vampire in front of her, our heroine simply lost the power of speech and the ability to move. The monster instantly opened its mouth wide and began to reach for the girl, but as if out of nowhere, help came. Cheyenne appeared in this alley at the call of his heart and smashed the monster against the wall with all his might. There was much more rage in the guy's eyes than in the eyes of this real vampire. Cheyenne immediately shouted and asked if Suha was okay and if she was hurt. The girl spoke in horror about how she had just gone to look for him, when suddenly this monster attacked her. At that very moment, the vampire was able to break free and continued his attack again, this time heading towards the guy. Everything happened so suddenly that Cheyenne didn't have time to react and simply fell to the ground. Our heroine knew she shouldn't show her strength, but she couldn't just stand there, so she decided to charge in. Instantly, the girl's eyes lit up with rage. Her blows were full of anger. But she also instantly jumped forward when the monster easily dodged to the side. Before the girl could even understand what had happened, the vampire's paws were once again reaching for Suha. It might have seemed like the end, but literally at that very moment, as if out of nowhere, John appeared and hit the monster with all his might. While the vampire was rolling on the floor, our heroine instantly rushed upward. It turned out that the reason for such a sudden jump was Noah, who took the girl in his arms. At first, our heroine couldn't even understand what was going on. Noah suddenly began apologizing, saying he'd been a bit hasty. The girl reassured him, saying she believed she'd been a princess in a past life. And yet, they soon landed on the ground, safe and sound. Cheyenne was overjoyed to see his brothers. Anyway, John's first thought was to ask Suha if she was okay before he continued dealing with the monster. The girl's fear was behind her thanks to Noah, causing her to nod her head in gratitude. John, breathing a sigh of relief, turned his head towards the creature, which was rising to its feet. He couldn't understand what this something was because the sun hadn't even set yet, and he had already decided to show up in a crowded place. But after quickly analyzing, the guy immediately realized that it was difficult for even a ray of light to reach this alley, and the vampire himself was wrapped in layers of clothing. And yet John, like everyone else, knew that other creatures besides them should not be active until the sun had completely set. There was no emotion in the vampire's eyes other than a thirst for blood, here and now. John was running through his thoughts, trying to come to answers to the questions he asked himself. But suddenly the monster's mouth opened and it began to make sounds that resembled words. After listening for a bit, all the boys heard that the vampire was demanding that they give the girl to the guy with green eyes in his arms. Both John and Cheyenne were shocked, as they instantly realized that this monster had its own plans for Suha, and deliberate ones at that. The guy wanted to say something else, but suddenly he felt danger. Turning my head, it turned out that this vampire was clearly not alone here. There were others. A whole crowd of vampires tried to get to Suha, causing her to start screaming in fear. John shouted sharply and ordered to take the girl away from here as far as possible, and where there are a lot of people. The guy had no intention of resisting the words, after which he nodded his head and was about to carry out the order. At that very moment, a crowd of enraged vampires began to scream and rushed forward straight towards the girl. Noah, without waiting for the disaster, made a sharp jump and flew away from the crash site. The guys moved very quickly, but our heroine clearly hadn't had time to get used to such speeds. Noah jumped on various bars, roofs, fences, and ran as fast as he could. Our heroine was terrifyingly surprised because at some point it began to seem to her that they were teleporting. And if you think about it, she could be right. Because before that, he also appeared too abruptly, picked her up and took off. And at that very moment, he was carrying her with incredible speed, from which she did not have time to recover. The girl understood that she was getting worse and worse with every second, so she had to do something. Suddenly, she screamed and asked Noah to stop. Only upon hearing the girl's sweet voice did the boy look at her in surprise. While our heroine was vomiting, Gino was incinerating his enemies and torturing them one last time. The guy wanted to beat all the information he could out of the vampires because he wanted to know their initial goal. Suddenly, Jaka addressed him, calmly stating that they were a lower class of vampires who had almost no intelligence. That's why the guy suggested that there was no point in expecting answers from such idiots. Solon also suddenly snuck up, and the first thing he did was ask what was wrong with Suha. John stated that Noah took her to the very center of the square so that they would be safe. Soon, Solon screamed in rage and began blaming Cheyenne for what had happened. He couldn't understand how such a thing could have happened when he was right there. The guy started to get nervous and explained, saying that he stepped away for a minute to buy tickets, but when he returned, she was already gone. Solon was simply furious, so he began to scold his brother, not understanding how he could leave a man who didn't even know the way back. Gino decided to intervene in this quarrel and asked Solon to stop, because no one could have foreseen that vile vampires would appear here and now. After a sudden sharp blow of metal, a voice was heard a little further away from them. Haley finished his business with one of the monsters, stating that all this was not a simple coincidence as it might seem at first glance. At this time, Noah and Suha landed successfully, but the girl felt extremely bad. Our heroine sighed heavily and declared that this was the first time she had experienced this, which is why she felt so sick. But the guy continued to apologize because he was very worried about her, so he didn't have time to think. Noah wanted to know how he could help her, but our heroine assured him that everything was fine. Moreover, after saying that they needed to catch their breath, she decided to thank Suha. At first, the guy didn't understand what she was talking about, but the girl clarified that he comes to her aid every time. Hearing these words, Noah didn't even know what to say and immediately blushed. And yet she didn't expect his answer, so she asked her own question. She was curious how he knew everything. The guy looked at her in surprise as if he had no idea what she was talking about. Our heroine wanted to explain to him what she was talking about, but suddenly her speech, like herself, simply froze. While Noah was sheepishly telling something, Suha noticed a person a little further away whom she never expected to meet. In the middle of the arch stood Chris, who clearly didn't look like himself, but he looked alive. Moreover, the guy raised his head and showed his eyes, which were very alive, although a little empty. At that very moment, while Helly was calling her by telepathy, our heroine ignored all the words, and with tears in her eyes screamed the name of her old friend. She also immediately rushed from her place and ran towards Chris, not wanting to lose him. Helly continued to reach out to the girl, trying to make sure everything was okay. Suha couldn't answer him clearly, which made the guy very nervous. He told her not to leave and to wait for him, as he would be back soon. Suddenly, Khan stood in front of our heroine, causing the girl to instantly freeze. The guy was clearly glad to see her, and was even surprised that she came for a walk in the square today. Khan continued to ask various questions, and our heroine did not know how to get rid of him. Turning her head, the girl noticed to her horror that Chris had disappeared and was no longer standing where he had been. Suddenly, Noah stood in front of our heroine, answering Khan's question instead of Suha, stating that he came with her. Khan became a little wary, which is why he asked in surprise if they really came here together. Suha started talking about how the others were here too. But Noah asked in surprise what business he had with their evening. Just at that moment, the rest of the guys showed up, looking for Khan and wanting to have a boat race. Tahel suddenly saw Suha and began to greet her joyfully. He was glad to see her, but he also suddenly discovered Noah, who was not glad to see them. As if from some meme, Cheyenne and the guys who were walking towards Suha also suddenly appeared. Cheyenne was happy and radiated happiness until he saw who was standing next to Suha. Seeing Enzi, Tahel, Najak, and Khan, the guy was speechless, not understanding what they were doing there. Suddenly, Helly came up to our heroine and hugged her, causing the girl to jump. The guy apologized for being late, saying he should have arrived earlier. Helly admitted she was very worried about him. Our heroine smiled at him and said that everything was fine, and on the contrary, she was grateful to them for coming to help. But their conversation wasn't private. Khan, perplexed, approached the vampires and asked why they had suddenly become so concerned about Suha. The girl turned her head and, as if nothing had happened, declared that vampires had just appeared here. The guys were simply horrified that these creatures could appear on the square at such a time. John reassured them, saying that they had dealt with them so there was nothing to worry about. Khan didn't understand how he could say such words, because they would not have allowed Suha to be in danger in the first place. John's face instantly changed because he was angry because they were trying to portray them as bad friends. Gino sighed heavily and grabbed John by the shoulder sharply, deciding to calm him down. At that moment, Khan approached Suha and asked her not to hang out with these fools, and he said this for her own good. Tahel joined the discussion and invited the girl to go for a walk with them the following weekend. Cheyenne abruptly approached the girl and declared that she had already promised to go for a walk with them. Tahel adjusted his cap, bracing himself for a harsh retort. The guy said they could meet in a week. Cheyenne raised his head and, with a sage look, declared that in a week or two she would be walking with them. Forever, endlessly. The boys started a verbal altercation from which no one could emerge victorious, so their quarrel would be endless. Gino and Khan decided to put an end to this mess, and therefore came to pick up the guys and separate them from this stupid battle. Cheyenne approached Suha again and decided to tell her that his birthday was in 3 weeks and he hoped she would come. Our heroine, without hesitation, agreed. Tahel heard everything and shouted in anger, declaring that he had just made it all up. The guy mockingly stated that this was not true, and if he didn't believe it, then he could also come to his party. Tahel and Najak were shocked that he decided to invite them to his birthday party, expecting them to come, but Suha happily said it would be great if they came too. The boys' faces instantly changed and they declared they would come. After some time, the action moves to the university dormitory building. Our heroine slept soundly in her bed, while at that time she was dreaming various dreams. The girl saw the pictures from the square again, realizing that the man she saw looked very similar to Chris, if he were still alive. And yet she translated her thoughts to the fact that she had imagined it all and this guy was just very similar. And yet she could not restrain her stream of thoughts, for she knew that she could not help but recognize him. Tears began to flow involuntarily. She couldn't understand why Chris hadn't looked for her and why he'd simply up and disappeared today. As if with a snap of a finger, the image before her eyes changed. The sound of the night breeze, the wind, the guy she saw in the square. There was no doubt that it was Chris, because his look said everything for him, even when he was silent. The girl, in despair, began to scream and say her name, hoping that he remembered her. She decided to remind him that they were close friends, that they played together every day, and Suha screamed that he talked to her, trusted her, that he was the one who asked her to bite him. The guy suddenly smiled at her, the same smile she knew from childhood. Chris said he remembered it all. Soon he took a couple of steps and hovered over her, declaring that he missed her. A moment later, the girl shuddered and opened her eyes. Tears were still streaming down her face. A dream. She immediately realized that this was another realistic dream of hers, and Chris could not have been in it. And yet, even though she knew all this, she could not sleep that night. The girl jumped out of bed and ran barefoot outside. She replayed her dream in her head and knew only one thing. Wherever she was, she knew Chris would find him, but she wanted to find him too, along with all the answers. The girl looked around and couldn't understand why it was so dark today, because there was a full moon outside. Suha wondered where all the moonlight had gone when she suddenly heard a wild howl behind her. She turned her head and with fright came to the conclusion that these were just stray dogs. But a moment later, she realized with horror that these were not dogs, because they were much bigger. Suddenly, a puzzled Khan approached our heroine and asked what she was doing there at such a time. Our heroine was very surprised by their meeting, just as surprised as by the strange feeling inside her. She looked at him and felt as if this wasn't the Khan she knew. His eyes and fangs gave it all away. The girl assumed it was because it was late. After taking a closer look, she dismissed such thoughts, deciding she'd simply imagined it. Suha suddenly screamed, embarrassed by the clothes he saw her in. The shocked guy began to reassure her, saying everything was fine. What was more important for Khan at the moment was to know why she had come here so late. The girl decided that she would be lying, so she said that she just wanted to see the sea at night. Khan was clearly surprised that she allegedly came here so late just to see the sea. Our heroine smiled shyly and said that she thought there would be a full moon today. However, now, looking at the sky, she could only see a lunar eclipse. Khan answered her that when the sun, earth, and moon stand in one line, the moon is hidden behind the shadow of the earth. That's why he led up to the fact that today is an incredibly special night. Suha nodded her head and stated that they had been through this before, but this was the first time she had seen it with her own eyes. At that moment, Khan was so embarrassed that he didn't even know how to continue the conversation while looking at Suha. But the girl helped him because she decided to start a new topic herself, suddenly remembering something. Suha, in fact, decided to ask what he was doing here at such a late hour. The guy scratched his head awkwardly and said that he just came to admire the eclipse. Suha asked suspiciously if he really came alone and why, since he and his friends were always together. Khan came to his senses and nodded sharply, confirming that he had come alone, but he was unable to immediately answer the question about his friends. With a heavy sigh, the guy decided to say that all the guys were already asleep. Soon after this, he turned to the girl and asked her to listen to what he had to say. The guy took a big step by offering to walk her back to her room as soon as she returned. He reminded her that she had met vampires today, and that was why he was worried about her. And he added in a whisper to himself that, on top of everything else, he wanted to spend a little more time with her. Our heroine nodded her head happily and stated that she had been a little scared today. Suddenly, she added the words that she had also seen some stray dogs that evening, which caused Khan to immediately respond to these words. The girl pointed her finger to the side, embarrassed, and said that on her way there, she had seen a pack of huge stray dogs. Suha, horrified, began to talk about how these animals were so gigantic that they looked like wolves, but fortunately they weren't. With some sympathy in her voice, the girl suddenly stated that she would not want them to attack anyone. Khan suddenly shouted, saying that they would never do that, especially those wolves. Suha was very surprised by Khan's reaction, so she logically assumed that he knew them. Realizing that the guy was in trouble, he began to say that he didn't know them, and assumed that wolves weren't such stupid animals. Our heroine's expression changed, and with a smile on her face, she said that he was right, because they were cool. Khan instantly beamed with happiness, glad she liked wolves. Suha said she'd love to meet them in person, as she'd only seen them on TV. But at the end of her thought, she stated that she thought wolves were actually scary. Khan also instantly cringed at the girl's words. Meanwhile, the action takes us to the next day, where the students were actively engaged in their activities. For example, our heroine was in the library at that time and was looking for something, when suddenly a voice called out to her. It was Helly who suddenly caught up with the girl in this place and decided to approach her. Approaching Suha, the guy assumed she'd come to pick up a couple of books. She nodded happily and asked him what he'd come for. Extending his hand, he said that he had only come to return a book he had finished reading. The girl decided to continue the topic with this book and asked what it was about. Helly's gaze changed slightly at that moment, as if he was trying to find the words to describe the book more simply. Eventually, he began to talk about how this book was about ancient myths that had come down to our times. The guy spoke about it with interest, telling that inside there were various stories about vampires and werewolves. Our heroine looked at him in surprise as soon as she heard the words about vampires and werewolves. The guy smiled and replied that they were known for their age-old animosity toward each other. The book was full of examples of them clashing. Suha nodded understandingly and concluded that werewolves are people who turn into wolves under the full moon. After this, the girl decided to inquire about what happens to them on the night of a lunar eclipse. She believed that because the moon is cast into shadow, they are unable to transform. Helly stated that he doesn't know this for sure, but he does know an equally interesting fact about these creatures. Werewolves fall in love with the first girl they meet on their way, and will love her for the rest of their days. Suha even became a little embarrassed at the moment and turned her head away, saying that it was very romantic. However, Helly added that lunar eclipses do not happen very often, which is why they rarely fall in love. Our heroine thanked him for this information and suddenly said that she had recently seen a lunar eclipse. Helly tensed up for a moment, knowing what that could mean, but he still decided to ask where it was. Our heroine decided to tell it like it was. So she said that the night after she went with them to the square, she returned there. The guy was instantly shocked because she managed to go to the square alone in the middle of the night. He wanted to know why and what had happened to her. Our heroine lowered her head guiltily and said that she just wanted to look at the night sea. Helly sighed with relief, as if in understanding. The girl suddenly continued that there should have been a full moon then, and yet, for some reason, it was so dark that she couldn't see her hands. And as it turned out, it was because of the lunar eclipse. Suddenly, she raised her head happily and said that Khan had told her about all this. She added that she had met him by chance on the beach. Helly immediately got goosebumps. In a slightly trembling voice, Helly asked if he understood correctly that she met Khan on the night of the lunar eclipse. Suha was a little confused about what the problem was, so she sheepishly said that it was indeed so. Helly forced a smile through his teeth and said everything was fine. He just wanted to ask. He also added that next time she should take him along. Our heroine, despite his answer, noticed that his face simply fell for a moment, so she assumed that he didn't like the fact that she was with Khan. And yet, the guy awkwardly decided to point out that he also loved the night sea, so he could keep her company. Suha nodded her head, but had already managed to get lost in her thoughts, starting to wonder why the Helly company and Khan did not get along so much. She knew they were rivals as teams from different schools, so she assumed it was directly because of that. The guys compete for the main prize every year, which means that in their case, the feud is completely justified, and besides, the tournament was supposed to take place soon. Helly suddenly pulled Suha out of her thoughts with his question, asking how her school days were going. The guy was glad to hear that she had no difficulties, but in case of a problem, he asked to call him at any time. Our heroine nodded her head approvingly and said that she would take this into account. Suddenly, our heroine, radiating happiness and joy, said that for the first time in her life, she was so happy to go to school. And of course, she showed her gratitude to Helly, because all this was possible only thanks to him. The guy decided not to accept such a number of thanks because it seemed to him that he had done nothing wrong. And besides, he was glad that she was having fun. Our heroine also added that she found a friend not only from him, but also from other guys who became her friends thanks to Helly. Just at that moment, Gino sensed what she was saying and instantly appeared behind her. The guy seemed to sense that she was in the library, but noticing Helly, he assumed that they both came for books. Our heroine nodded her head happily, and regarding Helly, she said that he came here to give the book. Suddenly, our heroine's face changed because she noticed the other guys, so she assumed that they all came for books too. John nodded his head with the utmost intelligence and said that reading was his hobby. Cheyenne then stated that he had come to pick up a book on introductory quantum mechanics. Only Noah, in bewilderment, ordered all the guys to stop hanging noodles on their ears, and he even told Jaka that he was reading the book upside down. Gino laughed awkwardly and said they all assumed she'd be here, which is why they came. He also added that none of them except Helly would read a line. While John was talking about something in bewilderment, Gino decided to ask what interesting thing they were chatting about. Our heroine stated that Healy was talking about the contents of a book about myths that had reached their times. She smiled happily and said that there were even stories about vampires and werewolves. At this moment, Gino, just like Helly earlier, became tense, inquiring about werewolves. Our heroine nodded her head and quoted the guy's words, saying that on the night of a lunar eclipse, a werewolf falls in love with the first person he meets and will love only her forever. The girl spoke about this with sincere joy, saying that it was very romantic. The whole group of guys just fell silent and stared at Suha, who seemed to be glowing with happiness while talking about werewolves. Cheyenne suddenly laughed, saying that he thought werewolves were half-ordinary mongrels. John also started nodding his head and saying that it was true that if you stood next to them, you would soon find yourself completely covered in fur. Noah aggressively stated that werewolves wouldn't even be 10% human, and Jaka just nodded his head. The guys unanimously said that werewolves looked like idiots, and Solon was horrified when he heard all this. And yet he couldn't help but get involved. So he said that a stray dog couldn't possibly be a human. They were just ordinary, pathetic, immature savages. Gino decided it was time to calm the boys down by starting to talk about how Suha thought they were romantic and that it was her right. Solon sighed heavily and said that he didn't think it was romantic to fall in love with the first person you passed by during a lunar eclipse. He gritted his teeth and said that this was just idiocy. But vampires were much more well-mannered, intelligent, neat, aristocratic. Suha decided to object at that moment, telling the guys that vampires, in fact, cannot experience love. Soon, she even switched to a half-scream, saying that vampires generally lack the warmth of a human heart from birth. The girl said that vampires, she thought, had no idea what true love was. Solon was shocked to hear these words. In the end, our heroine screamed not with her mouth, but with her soul, saying that all vampires are just cold-blooded and cruel monsters. Compared to vampires, she was sure that werewolves were many times better. While all the guys were silent and listened to all this negativity and didn't know how to react, our heroine said that she didn't even want to compare werewolves and vampires, because they were disgusting. At some point, our heroine stopped and fell silent, and a dead silence immediately fell. Helly was devastated because he clearly didn't think that everything was so bad in her attitude towards vampires. Suha immediately blushed because she didn't want to lose her temper and spill out all this negativity. She began to nervously apologize, saying that she did not want to ruin their mood, but the guys found the strength in themselves and calmed her down. The girl justified herself by saying that she simply couldn't stand vampires, when suddenly she heard Helly's understanding tone, which agreed with her. The guy smiled sincerely and said that no normal person likes vampires. Cheyenne, in turn, tensed up even more and exhaled heavily. It turned out he had something he wanted to show and tell Suha, but he couldn't do it verbally, and after hearing it, he doubted it even more. That evening, our heroine was sitting in her room and thinking about everything that had happened. The girl was about to get ready for bed when suddenly someone knocked on her door. Naturally, she jumped up abruptly and opened the door, and in front of her, she saw Helly, who had come to visit her. The guy smiled as he always does, and then asked if Suha had a free minute. Our heroine was a little confused after what happened in the library today, and yet she said that she was free. Having taken her seats, the girl still decided to apologize again for today's conversation, since they all left on level ground. The guy said that everything was fine and he knew how much she hated vampires, because she had already suffered a lot because of false suspicions. Helly showed her the utmost sympathy and understanding, for which our heroine was extremely grateful. And yet she lowered her head and said that, in addition to everything else, she had another, much more compelling reason. The guy suddenly tensed up and fixed his gaze on her, asking what else could have happened. The girl soon answered him that the main reason for her hatred was that the vampires killed Chris. Of course, Healy had no idea who this Chris was, which is why he asked to tell him more about him. Our heroine squeezed her skirt tightly and said through force that this man had been her only friend in her childhood. At a time when all other people avoided her and called her a vampire, he was the only one who believed her and played with her. With a smile, albeit an awkward one, the girl added that he once even offered to bite her because he believed her. The only problem was that she didn't believe in herself the way he did. She decided to refuse his offer. But the most terrible thing was that the vampires caught up with him one way or another, which is why people immediately buried the boy. Holding back her anger, our heroine addressed both herself and Helly, asking how she could be good to vampires. The girl, through the pain in her soul, asked if she could ever find a friend like him, and one could say that it was a rhetorical question. But Helly decided to act quickly and directly. He asked her one question. Did she want to bite him? Our heroine clearly didn't expect such a question, which is why she snapped her finger and turned redder than a tomato. Suha screamed in horror and utter embarrassment and said that she would never do that, and asked why he was even saying that. She also then began to nervously say that it wasn't that she was uncomfortable doing all this, but Helly was touched by the girl's reaction, while she continued to defend her position so actively, saying that they were little then. Our heroine, shocked, screamed that they were all grown up now and even growing. In a fit of embarrassment, nerves, and stress, she said something incomprehensible, hoping Helly would understand. But Healy, on the other hand, continued to add fuel to the fire. With a deft movement of his hand, the guy lowered the collar of her shirt and asked her to bite him, saying there was nothing wrong with it. The girl closed her eyes and screamed even louder that this was very strange and awkward, so she would not do it. The guy still decided to accept her decision, but added that this was one way or another an indicator of his trust in her. While our heroine stared at him in shock, expecting it to be some kind of stupid joke, Helly told her he was dead serious. At that moment, the girl turned her gaze away and shyly decided to ask if he could bite her. Helly clearly didn't expect such an answer, so a darkness of fear and horror covered him. The girl immediately came to her senses and screamed, noticing that, as she could see, he was also embarrassed. She then added that she just wanted to say how close and trustworthy Chris had been as a friend throughout her childhood. At that moment, she went the wrong way again because she began to feel sad, thinking that he was her most valuable friend. That's why she returned to the rhetorical question about how she could love vampires after everything that had happened. Suha even decided to admit that one of the reasons she wanted to transfer here was the local library. Everyone knows it contains a vast collection of books. She thought she could find a way to get rid of vampires among them. Suha lived with the desire to avenge Chris, but when she encountered the vampires that day and saw them with her own eyes, she felt a trembling fear. She felt as if her whole body had turned to stone. But thanks to this, she was finally convinced of one thing. Our heroine learned the truth that all vampires are real monsters. Helly, of course, could not listen to all these words without sadness in his eyes. But he nodded understandingly, saying that he understood her. Our heroine then decided to ask why he came to her so late. The guy came to his senses because he really did remember that he had one thought, so he started talking. At this time, Xian was sitting in his room and his face was extremely sad. The boys saw their brother's condition, so they assumed that it was all because of Suha's words. Gino encouraged Xian, telling him not to be upset because the girl didn't say it out of malice. But the guy wasn't so optimistic, so he decided to assume that if Suha found out who they were, she would simply be disappointed in them. All the guys were silent and didn't know what to say, because they themselves didn't want to. When suddenly the eternally cold-blooded Solan sighed and asked who cared what she thought of them. That's why the guy told his brothers not to get close to her because they should stay away from each other. At this point, Xian sighed even longer and louder, declaring that he, on the contrary, wanted to stay as close to Suha as possible. Noah suddenly wondered why Suha hated vampires so much. Solan continued again, asking in response who could like vampires, because from the point of view of people, their hatred is quite understandable. In response to all this nonsense, Jaka decided to remind people that, unlike many vampires, they do not harm people. The guy continued to talk about how no one cares about the classes of vampires and who eats whom, because to people they are all the same. Gino, of course, couldn't help but agree with Solan, since they couldn't ask Suha to take their word for it. At best, they could only exterminate the remaining vampires. Xian suddenly announced that he had the perfect emergency plan. They will tell Suha that among them only Solan was a vampire, and they themselves will get away with it. They would have suggested not to drag it out and get rid of him quickly, and Gino would have even given Suha a piece of his mind. The girl would proudly throw a torch towards the vile vampire, telling him to disappear. Xian, with tears in his eyes, told his brother that they would not forget his sacrifice, and that he would forever remain in their hearts. Solan screamed in disbelief, asking how they could even imagine such a thing. Noah had even added the wood, and Gino had set it on fire. And at that moment, as always, a fight broke out between the guys about the fact that someone had to sacrifice themselves. John suddenly turned to the guys and asked them to stop making jokes, because this would be their plan B. Solan screamed in shock and asked how this could even be a plan. John suggested that the brothers simply try not to get caught by Suha and not reveal that they were vampires. Noah nodded his head and said that if possible, it would be better if they didn't use their powers at all. Nevertheless, Jaka decided to remind them that if they were discovered, they would be hunted and they barely escaped from the shelter. Gino replied that even if the girl found out that they were vampires, Suha would hardly tell anyone about it. Solan, in turn, asked his brother with disbelief and surprise how he could know all this. He couldn't understand how Gino could just trust people after what they had been through. The action shifts to the past. A little girl, surprised, asked strangers who they were, what had happened to them, and where they came from. Helly and everyone else were wounded and looked at the girl in hopes of help. Realizing that the boys had escaped from the shelter, the girl took them into a warehouse, telling them that it was not in use, so they could feel at home and not worry. But after some time, when the girl decided to visit her friends late at night, she saw something she shouldn't have seen. The girl was incredibly terrified and didn't even know how to react. A few hours later, the boys were hunted. Frantic villagers ran around the area searching for the little monsters. At this time, the boys ran as fast as they could through fields and forests to be safe. And yet, at some point, they were caught up with. It was a woman who was glad to see them. In a cool voice, she said that she had warned them that there was only danger outside the shelter, so it was time to return to Vamfield House. Soon after this story, Solan again clarified that they could only rely on themselves. Meanwhile, our heroine received the envelope, realizing that it was an invitation to Healy's birthday party that he had told her about. The guy happily told her that he would be very happy to see her at his birthday party. Suha, without even thinking, said that she would definitely come, and then asked which of them would have a birthday. After a short pause, Helly replied that they all had the same birthday, since no one knew their own date of birth. Our heroine, of course, was surprised, but decided to ask what this day meant and what had happened. Looking down, the boy answered her in a calm voice that it was the day they escaped from the orphanage. The action moves forward sometime. The boys were standing near a luxurious country house in the woods. Our heroine was truly shocked by the size and beauty of both the house and the surrounding area. Haley and Cheyenne thanked her for coming and also added that the house was located in the middle of the forest, so they assumed it wasn't easy to get there. The girl replied that it wasn't that difficult, but she was very happy and surprised by the place, because she couldn't even imagine that such a luxurious mansion could stand in such a remote place. Cheyenne proudly declared that he'd built it himself and that it was truly awesome. Helly laughed and replied that they'd inherited it by pure chance. The boy explained that after escaping from the shelter, they hid here for a long time at the benevolence of a benefactor. In fact, he finished his thought by saying that the man bequeathed this mansion to them after his death. Anyway, he said they live and study at the school, so they only come here on weekends or during breaks. Cheyenne also added that he tends the garden here. And yet the girl was soon distracted by a voice coming from behind, calling her. Turning her head, she saw Khan in front of her, who was shyly saying that he was glad to see her, as well as Enzi, Najak, and Tahel. Our heroine happily replied that she was glad to see everyone and decided that everyone would be happy to see them. Cheyenne gritted his teeth and muttered a boring, "Not at all." Khan continued to talk to the girl awkwardly, deciding to ask how she was doing in general, since they hadn't seen each other for a long time. Cheyenne immediately stood in front of the girl and sarcastically began to say that they were glad that they came to them after they were invited as a joke. Tahel responded in the same tone that they had come so that they would not be too happy about their absence, and that there was no point in celebrating their birth. Suha screamed and decided to suggest that everyone go into the house to talk in a calmer environment. After a while, the birthday party was in full swing as people gradually gathered and started having a party. At this time, many were partying hard, but our heroine stood to the side and drank a cocktail, just like Khan, who didn't leave her side. The guy suddenly broke the quiet atmosphere between them by saying that he missed her very much. Our heroine happily replied that she was also very glad to see him, even though they had been corresponding with him all this time. But this was the first time they had seen each other in a long time. Suddenly, John, who had overheard the conversation, asked in bewilderment why this idiot was texting Suha. While he was angry, Khan could not remain calm, so he entered into a visual battle. Our heroine decided to lighten the mood with a surefire option. She showed a video of the cutest cat, the very ones Khan sent her every day. John's expression quickly changed, and he supported the girl, saying that it was very sweet, and he also asked her to forward the video to him. Our heroine spoke sweetly about how Khan told her that he loved animals just like she did. Cheyenne appeared out of nowhere and awkwardly decided to clarify that Khan didn't just love animals. Gino immediately shut his brother's mouth and said that he, by the way, has a lot of cute pictures of wolves. So he asked Suha if she liked them. Our heroine nodded her head happily and said that she really loved them. Khan blushed incredibly at that moment because he knew that he had already won this battle. But the girl added that she loves cats most of all, and after them, hamsters, bunnies, squirrels, sheep, and deer. In an instant, Khan both won and lost, which Xian and John couldn't help but gloat about. Suddenly, our heroine came to her senses, declaring that she hadn't yet managed to hand out the gifts, even though she had prepared them for everyone. She immediately pulled out the kit and presented it to the boys. She gave them the perfect vampire protection kit. The boys were instantly lost in their thoughts and didn't even know what to say in response. The girl calmly said that anything could happen in their time, so she prepared this for their safety. Gino walked up to Suha and happily accepted the set, stating that he would be happy to use it. Tahel suddenly beamed with happiness, saying that Suha was very thoughtful. Najak, holding back his laughter, added that the gift was wonderful. Suddenly, a puzzled Cheyenne asked the werewolves what they had brought them as a gift. Tahel handed him some pebbles, Najak handed him some grass, and Enzi said he had a greeting card. Khan then extended his hand, declaring that he was giving them dust, although it would be a pity for them to lose even that. But our heroine was surprised, because she saw that these were not all the gifts Khan had, so she asked what they were. The guy looked at her with a loving gaze and said that this was a gift, especially for her. Suha was shocked because she had no idea why he would give her any gift. The guy sheepishly said that he meant it to her from the heart for no reason. Then he asked her to open it quickly. As soon as our heroine opened the gift, she saw a photo frame with a photo of cute wolf cubs. Our heroine delightedly declared that she had never seen a photo cuter than this one. Khan was incredibly happy that she liked the gift because he tried. Our heroine looked at the cute wolf cubs for a long time, even saying that one of them for some reason looked like Khan. One way or another, the day was drawing to an end, so the sun was setting behind the horizon. Our heroine said goodbye to Helly, saying that it was already late and it was time for her to go home, but she really enjoyed today. The guy was glad to hear this, and our heroine then asked if she understood correctly that they were staying here. Haley smiled and said that they still had some cleaning to do, and then they would be too lazy to go home. Our heroine decided to offer her help, but the guy assured her that they could handle it, and advised her to be careful on the way back. Meanwhile, the boys stood waiting for Suha, calling her to come with them quickly. The girl and the boys said goodbye, saying that they would meet again at school. Suddenly, our heroine remembered that she had forgotten the photo that Khan had given her. The girl remembered that Cheyenne took this photo and never returned it to her, because he wanted to show the photo to others. Suha approached the guys and apologized, saying she'd forgotten something. Naturally, Najak offered to go with her, but our heroine turned around abruptly and said that this hike could take a long time, so she advised them to go without her. As the girl ran back to the estate, she couldn't understand how she had forgotten the gift from Khan that he had worked so hard on. Our heroine wanted to quickly return the photo and return home before the sunset. Soon she approached and opened the door with a creak. The girl said to the empty air that she had returned for the gift she had left with them. The first thing she saw was that there was complete chaos all around, which made her realize that they still hadn't started cleaning up. The girl walked past all this, assuming that they had decided to just take a break. But the next thing that confused her was the silence. This huge house was too quiet for a house containing Cheyenne and the others. Where had everyone gone? Climbing up the stairs, she finally saw a light in one of the rooms and immediately decided that the guys were there. Without thinking twice, she began to open the door without knocking and ask the boys if they were there. But what she saw inside horrified her, because she saw the same picture as the little girl who started the hunt. The girl was speechless. Her soul sank into her heels, and her thoughts were lost somewhere along the way. Clearly, every boy in the room turned their gaze towards Suha. Solon, upon seeing the girl, couldn't even utter a word, but Heli immediately got goosebumps because this was the worst thing that could happen in his opinion. Our heroine, horrified, began to take steps back, stomping further and further away from them over and over again. At that moment, the boys unanimously shouted her name and began to rise to approach her. Heli was one of the main ones who shouted and asked the girl to stop, saying that he could explain everything. But what our heroine saw above all else were the huge fangs that protruded from his jaw. The girl didn't even intend to give him a chance, so she immediately turned around and started running from the estate. Heli wasn't going to let her go that easily, so he started running after her. The guy immediately began to speak to her telepathically, saying that he could explain everything if she gave him a chance. But Suha stuck to her guns and didn't even want to hear it in her head. Suddenly, the girl screamed and said that it was creepy, so she told him not to even contact her telepathically. Hearing these words, the guy could do nothing but stop and understand that it was all over. Solon noticed his brother's gaze and froze in horror just as he did. At this time, our heroine got out of the estate and ran as fast as she could. The girl was out of breath from lack of endurance, and yet the only thought that was in her head was what the hell was going on. She couldn't believe that Heli and all the other guys were actually vampires. The girl instantly realized that this was why the boys had abilities. The girl immediately began to replay various events that happened not long ago. For example, the first thing that came to her mind was Khan and the others, who didn't just show up that evening. She also recalled an evening alone with Heli, where she asked him to bite her. The girl clearly remembered the horror in Heli's eyes, realizing that it was not because he was embarrassed. But the most important thing is that he said that he believed her, which is why the girl decided that he said all this only to get her to trust him. Tears involuntarily ran and dripped onto the ground. The girl did not know where to put herself and all her thoughts. For the first time since Chris's death, she felt like she had found real friends. For the first time in a while, Suha felt like she had met someone with whom she shared similar secrets. She felt the joy of school life for the first time and thought that everything would only get better. But they were all just lying to her. At some point, the girl simply collapsed to the ground, knowing she couldn't run any further. The girl was crying incredibly loudly, but even so, she heard a rustling sound behind her. Turning her head, she saw a silhouette, which made her think that it was Heli who had caught up with her. The girl screamed and told him not to even come near her because she might fight back. At some point, she screamed that she hated vampires more than anything. And just at the moment of her scream, he, the vampire from the square, emerged from the shadows. The girl instantly fell silent and again felt that trembling she had spoken of. The action moves back to the moment when the girl ran away from the house and the boys looked into the passage in bewilderment. Heli immediately turned to the boys and told them to sit still while he caught up with her. But just before the guy ran away, Solon stopped him, asking what he would do after this. What would he tell her? The guy reminded his brothers how she saw them, and that meant only the end for them. Cheyenne turned his head towards Heli in horror and asked what they should do now. Solon shouted in anger, saying that it was obvious. Now rumors would spread throughout the school and they would have to run away and wander again. Noah adjusted his shoulder at that moment and stood up from the ground, asking if they really thought Suha would tell everyone. Solon decided to remind her that she herself said that she hates vampires more than anything in the world. That's why the guy was sure that she wouldn't ignore them, studying with them in the same school. John responded by saying that they should first try to meet and talk in a calm environment. Jaka agreed with John and asked Heli to contact her at least through telepathy. In response, the guy said that if he did this, he might scare the girl even more. Gino shouted loudly and asked Noah to find out the girl's location. After a few moments, he began to talk about how the waves coming from her were quite strong, so he could... At that very second, he became incredibly scared because he felt something he didn't want to feel. The guy, horrified, began telling the other guys that at the moment there was a whole gathering of vampires around Suha. At this time, our heroine was indeed surrounded by a whole crowd of ferocious monsters. The girl stood like a petrified statue, not knowing what to say, let alone what to do. But at that moment, Heli ran towards her as fast as he could to help her and try to justify himself. The guy turned to Noah and asked to direct him to where Suha was now. The guy answered him that right now he was running straight to her, so everything was fine. He also added that they were running right behind him, so they would back him up if anything happened. Heli at the moment could not think about anything except the girl's safety. He even forgot about the nightmare that happened. At this time, the vampires were attacking the girl, overwhelming her with their numbers. One of the monsters suddenly began to attack the girl, making a dash towards her. Suha reflexively managed to dodge, but she didn't even need to because something protected her. Having deftly slipped past the monsters, she began to run and try to escape from them, but the vampires weren't going to let her go that easily either. So she had to compete for her safety. Once again, the girl deftly dodged and hit one of the monsters in the chest with all her might. Soon after, a fist flew into the face of another monster that was about to attack her. She turned around sharply and was about to hit someone else, but things couldn't continue that successfully. Right in front of her face, there was a bunch of vampires who were too close to her. At that very second, one of them grabbed the girl tightly by the throat and had no intention of letting go. The girl wanted anyone to help her, when suddenly a picture of Heli covered in blood appeared in front of her face. At that moment, the girl shouted the name of Khan and the guys too loudly, asking them to help her. Luckily for her, they actually heard Suha's scream and responded to it. But the girl at this time was thinking that her end would soon come, because the vampire continued to strangle her. And in just a moment, half of the monster's head literally flew off its shoulders. Her savior was Heli, who broke through a crowd of other monsters like a beast. The first thing the guy did was ask the girl if she was okay, because he was very worried. And yet, instead of gratitude, the girl became frightened and began to walk back. The boy understood her state, but he still tried to convey that they were not who she thought they were. The girl asked with tears in her eyes if they weren't vampires. Heli knew what he had to say, but he couldn't because there was a lump in his throat. The girl cried more and more, begging him to tell her that all this was not so, and that she had misunderstood everything. At that moment, Heli also couldn't contain his emotions, and tears began to roll down his eyes. Our heroine approached him and asked if he had said that he believed her only because he knew that she was not one of them. The guy screamed in bewilderment and said that this was not how she had imagined it. Tears began to flow from Suha's eyes more and more. She couldn't understand how Heli could trust her so easily. The guy wanted to say something in response, but suddenly the girl heard a familiar voice. Deciding that it was Khan, she turned her head, but in front of her she saw Chris, who had come to her. Our heroine was in incredible shock, just like Heli. Nevertheless, the girl immediately ran up to her old friend asking if it was really him. At this time, Noah contacted Heli via telepathic communication, calling him with concern. The guy, while defending himself from the vampires, wanted to make sure that he was close to Suha. Heli couldn't understand what was happening because the messages were intermittent and the words were incomprehensible. At the moment when Noah tried to answer, he was saved by Gino, who jumped out in front of him and killed the monster. John wasn't far behind either. The boy deftly disposed of the vile monsters. Jaka was apparently one of the most deadly, as his magic could silence several opponents at once. Khan, in shock, destroyed monsters with his friends and could not understand what was going on here. At this moment, Noah managed to contact Heli again, literally screaming about something terrible. The guy said that right now with Suha, he feels the same strength of waves as she does. Suha at this point turned to the man who looked, or was, Chris, asking if it was really him. The boy, with the same smile as in childhood, in a calm voice, said that everything was correct. And it was him. Our heroine had no idea how he could have survived and now stand before her. After all, he was executed then. The guy asked the girl to remember the day when he asked her to bite him. Without thinking twice, the girl threw herself into his arms and began to sob bitter tears. She started talking about all her experiences and how much she missed him. The girl said that she had never forgotten him for a second, and continued to tell him a lot of things that had accumulated. But the worst thing Heli could hear was that she said that he was the only friend who believed her. However, the guy interrupted her and apologized for not showing up earlier. Chris looked into her eyes and said that he missed her very much too. And yet he was afraid that she would not believe that he was alive again. He knew no one would believe it, and yet he hoped that she would believe him. He desperately wanted to find her, and she couldn't imagine how hard he searched for her. And yet, at that moment, his gaze became terrifying. The guy was saying that it took him a very long time to find her. Heli immediately tensed up because he felt that something was wrong, but he had to make sure. The girl, with tears in her eyes, told him that she believed him, but she had been through too much. The guy suddenly took her hand and leaned over and said that she would now be his princess forever. Our heroine was confused, so she decided to ask what was going on. Chris fell silent thoughtfully, and soon after, with greedy desire, began to pull his fangs towards the girl's hand. True, at that very moment, Heli reacted and prevented the bite. The guy aggressively grabbed Chris's neck and squeezed it, while Suha started screaming in horror and asking what he was doing. He wasn't even going to listen to the girl now. He was shouting and calling out to Chris, telling him to get out of here. The guy laughed in response, squeezed Helly's hand, and stated that he should stay away from Suha. Now Suha screamed in horror at the actions of her old friend. And yet, a moment later, Noah landed between them, coming to the rescue. The guy instantly turned his head and swung his fist, which flew into Chris's face. This was too weak for Chris, who immediately counterattacked and sent the guy flying. Our heroine was horrified, because now one of his friends had been injured by Chris, which is why she did not understand what was happening to him. Chris turned his head and declared that he was saving her from those stupid vampires. A whole hail of blows fell on Chris alone from all sides. But even so, he easily dodged. Moreover, he had so much time to think that he managed to counterattack. Following Solon, John and Gino went on the attack, intending to crush him with a double blow. But they failed immediately after Chris stopped their fists with his hands alone. To Gino's horror, the guy even started to laugh, not believing that this was all they were capable of. Suddenly, a mystery appeared in his eyes. And then the guy was surprised. Assuming that none of them remembered anything, at the moment he decided that it would be even better this way. But suddenly something distracted him. Shadows began to thicken on all sides and move in one direction only. They began to envelop Chris's body. Within a moment, a surge of energy began to flow in different directions. Of course, all this was the work of Jaka, who came to the aid of his brothers. Chris began to realize that something not particularly good was starting to happen, which is why it was time to end the show. On top of everything else, the guy discovered that werewolves were running behind him in response to Suha's call for help. Khan, approaching closer, began to shout and ask Suha if everything was okay with her. Jaka, perplexed, turned to Chris and decided to find out who he was and what he wanted from Suha. At that moment, Chris smiled creepily and asked the guys if they really didn't know anything. A moment later, an explosion of incredible proportions was heard. This explosion was incredibly powerful, causing all the guys to be scattered around and leaving them unconscious. With great difficulty, at some point, Heli began to get to his feet, asking the others if everything was okay. Khan suddenly answered, asking through pain and a hoarse voice what had happened to Suha. Heli instantly jumped up, realizing that Suha was currently in danger. At this time, Chris grabbed the girl and, holding her tightly in his arms, took her as far away as possible. Our heroine tried to escape from his hands, tried to fight back and understand what he was doing. The guy immediately replied that he was protecting her from those bloodsuckers and was not going to hurt her. An image of a shocked Heli instantly appeared in her head, reminding her that they were indeed vampires. And yet Chris told her that he would take her now to a safe place where no one would touch her. The guy hoped that she believed him, and he even reminded her that he was the only friend who believed her, so she should trust him. Immediately after these words, the guy felt someone else's presence, because of which he could not continue to move forward. Turning his head, he noticed Heli in front of him, looking into his soul. Without thinking twice, the guy waved his hand to hit Chris. But right after he missed, our heroine screamed and told him to stop. After repeating this request several times, the guy literally froze in place and could not do anything, no matter how much he wanted to. Chris was only too happy to take advantage of this opportunity, so he kicked Heli as hard as he could. Our heroine began to scream in horror because she was confused and did not know what she should do. In that moment, she pushed Chris away from herself and started running towards Heli, trying to help him. But she couldn't run away because Chris grabbed her and asked why she was going to go to the spawn. The guy started showing his fangs and asking if Suha had really forgotten who he died because of. However, she suddenly dropped his hand and declared that he was not Chris, after which she screamed and asked who he was. The guy grinned and decided not to even try to hide his true self. Repeating the same question, he bared his fangs and started running towards Suha to bite her. However, at that very moment, Solon arrived, put his hand out, and received an incredibly painful bite. Chris instantly realized that this was not the right thing to do and reacted. He was not going to leave alive those who were in his way. The guy deftly turned over and grabbed Solon by the neck. Our heroine started screaming and running towards the guys to somehow help her friend, but at that moment, Chris simply waved his hand and pushed the girl to the other side so that she would not interfere with him. Our heroine fell to the ground and stopped moving because she was unconscious. What happened made Solon incredibly angry, so much so that he could no longer contain himself. In the blink of an eye, something began to happen that was difficult to explain to an ordinary person. By that time, our heroine began to come to her senses and try to get up. Realizing what was happening and where she was, Suha turned around again to help Solon. But at that very moment, he was confronted with a terrifying sight. Chris, who had previously held Solon, was now holding a huge blue wolf. Our heroine was speechless because she immediately realized that it was Solon. The guy didn't intend to think for long about what and how, so he immediately counterattacked. Another moment later, he opened his mouth and bit Chris's throat. But even so, with the last of his strength, Chris was able to fight back the wolf and push him back. The wolf fell to the ground with a crash a few meters away and fell unconscious. Our heroine screamed in even greater horror, because she was very worried about her friend. At the moment when Chris began to get up and come to his senses, Khan and the guys who were going to help had already arrived. The guy was simply furious because once again everything was being ruined for him and he was not given any peace. Chris was about to destroy them with his magic, but at the last moment our heroine kicked him and told him to stop. The guy looked at her and angrily declared that he didn't want to do this. But if she continued to interfere with him, he would have no other choice. He aimed his blow in her direction, declaring that he would have to knock her out to take her with him. But right at the moment of the collision, Helly managed to snatch the girl right from under Chris's hands. The guy got hit a little on the back, but nevertheless he was able to protect the girl and fell relatively close. Just at that moment, Khan, in bewilderment, began to tell his friends that this creature was far from an ordinary vampire. That's why they decided that they had to attack with full force, so they immediately took on wolf forms. Chris heard an incredible noise behind him, causing him to turn his head sharply. In front of him, he immediately noticed a whole pack of wolves flying towards him with the desire to tear him to pieces. At that very moment, all 4 wolves unanimously grabbed Chris's body. Meanwhile, Haley, standing over Suha, asked her if she was okay, since that was all he was worried about at the moment. Despite the huge wound on his back, the guy hoped that the girl was not hurt in any way. The girl, horrified, began to say that she did not know what was happening, because this was not the Chris she once knew. She cried, overcome with all the emotions that overwhelmed her, without even being able to put it all together. Suddenly, Helly bowed his head in front of her with regret and began to ask for forgiveness. The girl was currently in a state of shock and couldn't understand what was happening, but at some point she heard Helly asking her for forgiveness for being the way he was. The guy said that she could hate him for the rest of her life, but he asked her to let him take her away from here. With tears in his eyes, he spoke of wanting to take her to a safe place. Meanwhile, the battle between Chris and the werewolves continued, and this battle was quite fierce. The guy didn't have much time to come to his senses and catch his breath. And just as he managed to fight off the werewolves, Noah suddenly came out to fight him again. At that very moment, the guy turned around and began to use his magic to get rid of at least one vampire. But nothing happened because instantly his legs were wrapped in shadows that stopped him. The guy understood that things were bad for him, because at the moment he was completely unarmed and vulnerable. Just at that moment, all the guys started flying towards him at once to smash him into dust. That is why Chris, although he did not want to, admitted his defeat. Immediately after this, there was an incredibly bright flash, followed by a loud explosion. After the boys were able to see something, they only realized that he had evaporated. Since that was the case, one problem was over, so everyone unanimously asked what happened to Suha. Meanwhile, the girl sat alone with Helly, who was still able to take her to a safe place. Just at that moment, the guy with a smile on his face asked if everything was okay with Suha, if she was hurt. The girl suddenly came to her senses and said that everything was fine thanks to him. Soon after, she raised her head and asked what was wrong with him. She hoped he wasn't too upset. The guy smiled and decided not to bother her again, so he said that he was completely fine. After laughing, he decided to joke, saying that he shouldn't die from such scratches. Suddenly, our heroine simply turned her head away and began to ask for forgiveness. Helly didn't understand this point, so he directly asked why she was apologizing, because he wanted to apologize to her. He decided to sincerely apologize for deceiving her, because after escaping from the orphanage, they lived, hiding their essence from everyone. They especially wanted to hide their true nature from her because she was dear to them. The guy couldn't tell her the truth because they weren't afraid to appear as vampires in front of others, but rather they were afraid of disappointing her. Helly looked into the girl's eyes full of questions and apologized again on behalf of all the guys. Our heroine turned her gaze to the side and declared that her head was now completely confused. She couldn't quite believe that they all turned out to be vampires. Suddenly, she turned her head and reminded him that he said they all grew up in the same orphanage. But back then, she was wondering how they became vampires. The guy, with bitterness and tears in his eyes, said that he himself did not know how they became vampires. Unfortunately, none of the guys could answer this question because no one knew the answer. The guy said that they had been vampires for as long as they could remember. They grew up in complete confinement, in a place that was only nominally a shelter. That's why, whether they were bitten by a vampire, born that way, or whether someone made them that way, Helly, like everyone else, simply couldn't be sure of anything. But more importantly, unlike other vampires, neither sunlight, nor crosses, nor holy water had almost no effect on them. In this case, our heroine asked in surprise how they knew that they were vampires, even though they had special powers. Suha assumed that they might be ordinary people like her. But after thinking for a bit, Helly answered her that they are drawn to blood. They have an instinct for bloodlust that does not give them peace. The guy added that apart from blood, they don't need any other water or food. He knew that they would not die even if they did not eat anything, but they only feed on blood one day a year, on their birthday. Haley also added that they only drink the blood of dead animals, have never attacked people, and do not know the taste of their blood. Each of the boys swore an oath that none of them would even taste human blood. The boy wasn't lying and hoped Suha would believe him. He understood that even though nothing terrible had happened, he would try his best to earn her trust. He also understood that it was more than natural for her to feel terrified of them. Tears rolled down his face of their own accord. Suddenly, our heroine decided to move away from the topic. She was curious about why he had decided to come after her. He was afraid that she would curse him or tell the whole school who they were. But the guy said he had to do it. He felt like he absolutely had to do it. Ever since he met her for the first time in the hallway, something had clicked inside him. He felt that she was like his destiny, who he was, what kind of life he should live, and what the purpose of his existence was. The answers to these questions seemed to elude him time and time again. But then, for the first time in his life, he felt that he had finally discovered a clear light. The guy was sure that he was born to protect her and must live for her protection. Our heroine looked at him without taking her eyes off him, but at some point she asked if he wanted to bite her. At first, the guy didn't understand what he had just heard. And then he turned around in horror and said that he didn't want that under any circumstances. But the girl grabbed him and turned him around. Looking into his eyes, she declared that she believed him. After a while, she exposed her neck and the guy joined her. This continued for some time, but at some point, Helly pulled away and asked Suha if everything was okay. The girl, with a smile on her face, although blushing, said that everything was fine because he had just touched her with his lips. Next, she decided to ask how he was feeling, because, frankly speaking, the guy didn't look well. At that moment, the girl asked, embarrassed, if he really wanted to taste her blood. The guy replied sheepishly that if he told her that he hadn't felt thirsty, he would be lying. Yet he was much more afraid of not living up to her expectations, so he didn't want to disappoint her. Helly knew she had taken a big step by trusting him, knowing he was a vampire. The guy didn't want to lose her trust for anything in the world, so he would try his best. But in response to all this, our heroine turned to him and said that he had never disappointed her. He himself knew that during all this time she had despised vampires most of all, and considered all of them, without exception, to be the most dangerous creatures. And yet he always came to her aid when she was in danger. Suha admitted that she was glad every time he appeared. So even though he was a vampire, she didn't find him disgusting. And of course, laughing, she noted that this was about all of them. Then she decided to apologize for her terrible words because it was rude of her. She noticed that he was always himself and was sincere with her. Now Suha was glad that they knew a little more about each other, so she wants them to become even closer from now on. The guy listened to her with his mouth open the whole time, but of course he agreed to her proposal, so he shook her hand. But they couldn't sit quietly for long because just a few moments later, Noah got in touch, looking for them. Of course, the guy relayed the information that this freak just up and disappeared. After that, Noah asked what everyone standing nearby was interested in. Was Suha okay? He nodded his head happily and said that everything was fine, and then asked if everything was fine with them. Noah replied that they were fine, a little battered, but would survive. The guy asked if they needed to go to them. Helly asked in bewilderment if they really all wanted to come here, and this question sounded too surprised. It was precisely because of this tone that Noah decided that if they showed up, Suha would be against it. At that moment, Helly looked at Suha with a smile, waiting for her answer. The girl screamed joyfully, telling the boys that they would come to them themselves. After some time, the guys approached everyone else who were already waiting for them. The guys were beside themselves with happiness, which is why they immediately started talking to her. Our heroine thanked everyone who came to help her because thanks to them, she was safe. She asked if everything was okay with them, to which Khan happily replied that she shouldn't even think for them, because they were much stronger than they looked. And of course, the guy couldn't help but touch on another important topic, since she probably noticed that they were not ordinary people. Our heroine nodded her head and asked in surprise if they were all really werewolves. Khan lowered his head and said that each of them had been a werewolf since childhood. Of course, our heroine was in shock because she had no idea that they, in particular Khan, were actually a werewolf. One way or another, the guy began to apologize for scaring her, because they hid their essence from others. They especially didn't want to talk about themselves to her because they didn't want to scare her. In his words, she heard an exact retelling of the words of Helly, who had just said the same thing. And yet, the boys unanimously said that they were sure that she would stop seeing them as the same people and would become afraid of them. And Khan and the others were also afraid that she would be disappointed in them once she learned the truth hidden from her. And yet he admitted that at that moment there was simply no other way to act. When her salvation was at stake, he didn't care if she hated him forever. Our heroine was shocked by everything she heard, because their thoughts also intersected with Healy, because he said literally the same thing. And yet she decided to say that she did not hate them, whoever they were. She will treat them well just like she treats vampires because they are good people. Our heroine soon approached the guys and thanked each one personally, saying that she was grateful to all of them. The girl stated that she lived for a long time hiding her abilities, and when they accepted the real one, she was incredibly grateful to them for it. That's why she wondered if they could give her a chance to do the same for them this time. The boys laughed and agreed without hesitation because they couldn't ask for more. Our heroine was pleased with this answer, which is why she suggested that everyone get even closer. The action shifts forward a bit. It's just at this time that active training for the tournament has begun. Noah, as always, took the lead, grabbing the ball and starting to run incredibly fast. Having run to the right place, he made a deft throw towards the goal. A moment later, there was a noise and the gate began to spin, which meant only the winning throw. The guy turned around and proudly began to talk about how much he could still do. And yet, soon the training was over, and the boys were resting after it, sitting on the grass. Suddenly, Suha came up to them, and they were incredibly happy to see her. Cheyenne immediately jumped up, thinking she'd come to cheer them on. The girl smiled and said she'd come to watch their practice. After all, she knew that the nightball competition was just around the corner, so she was interested in how the training was going. John suddenly appeared in front of her and told her that she shouldn't worry, because this time victory would undoubtedly be theirs. The guy looked at her with sparkling eyes and declared that he would dedicate this victory to her. While the girl was laughing and thanking him for such a wonderful gesture, Helly's voice was heard behind her. The guy thanked her for coming to support them because it was very valuable to them. Helly even declared that he would give it his all for her. Our heroine immediately blushed and declared that they would definitely win. Next, Solon, still a bore, approached her. He told her that if she stood there, she'd get hurt, so it was best not to come. Our heroine laughed, unable to resist teasing him. Approaching him, she decided to ask if he was really worried about her getting hurt. The guy, perplexed, said that this was not so. It was just that her presence was interfering with their competition, and she was distracting them. The girl decided to suggest and clarify that she was bothering him. Solon angrily declared that he hadn't meant it that way. Nevertheless, the girl approached him and asked to talk after training, because she had something to say. Of course, he had no idea what was going on, but he couldn't refuse, so he agreed. That night, under the moonlight, the boys met at the fountain. The boy asked her in a cool voice what she wanted. He had no idea what she wanted, so he asked what she wanted to tell him. The girl smiled and said that he could change his clothes calmly since she did not rush him. The guy shouted aggressively and said that they should only talk about business. Suha suddenly stated that she wanted to thank him and apologize at the same time. In particular, she wanted to communicate with him without fail. Our heroine heard that for a long time he kept it a secret, even from his brothers, that he could transform into a werewolf. And yet, on that terrible day, he did it because of her. Revealed his second nature. The guy turned away in bewilderment, blushed, but declared that he had transformed only because that guy had made him furious. Even though she said it had nothing to do with her, the girl thanked him because he saved her. And what's more important is that Chris showed up because he wanted to take her away. Solon suddenly decided to ask who this guy was and why he suddenly decided to take her away. The girl sighed heavily and said that she herself didn't know, because in childhood he was her only friend. Suha just didn't know how he could change so much and why he was trying to take her away. In any case, she stated that he might show up again and she was very afraid of it. This situation alone made her incredibly sad, because he was her most precious and closest friend. Solon suddenly decided to ask if she was sure that the freak was actually Chris. What if they just looked alike? The girl said that he knew the secret that was kept between them and she never told it except him. Solon asked if it was true that she hadn't told him anyone, since this factor would have been very important. Our heroine suddenly said that Helly had once told him, but no one else knew about it. Suddenly, our heroine was overwhelmed by memories and thoughts that stunned her. She remembered that very dream that seemed too real to her. The girl, in bewilderment, screamed and told herself her name, who she was, and who he was to her. In the dream, she said that they were close friends in the past. They played together every day. She remembered Chris telling her that he trusted her, and he asked her to bite him. At that moment, the guy felt like he had hit the jackpot, but he decided not to reveal his cards. With a smile on his face, he portrayed his friend, saying that he certainly remembered all of this. The girl summed up in horror what she had said about all this to Chris from the dream. Solon tried to follow the thread, so he clarified that she told him everything in a dream. Our heroine nodded her head and said that sometimes she has incredibly realistic dreams, so much so that she remembers every sensation and even smells. However, Solon stopped her and asked her in horror if she was sure that all this was just a dream. Suddenly, she remembered a moment from the past where the guy was clarifying all the information about her. He knew that she was constantly moving from place to place, did not go out into the light during the day, and wandered around alone at night. It was the words about her walking around at night that really horrified her. The girl decided to clarify whether she understood correctly that if it was not a dream, then it was sleepwalking. And even if that were the case, she still felt that something didn't add up. In the dream, when she saw Chris on the beach near the square, something was wrong. She couldn't understand how she could have gotten there in such a short time. But more importantly, she wanted to know how she could have accidentally met Chris there. In any case, she could only explain all this as a dream. Anyway, Solon shouted and said that she shouldn't dwell on it. He assured her that if this freak showed up again, then he, or rather, even all of them, would somehow deal with him. Our heroine smiled and, looking at Solon, thanked him for both then and now. The guy sighed and said everything was fine, so they went to bed. A few moments later, the door to our heroine's room slammed shut, meaning the girl was home. That was exactly why Solon stood there, just to make sure she was safe. Suddenly, he turned around in bewilderment and asked why they were here at such a time. In front of him stood Khan and Enzi, who greeted him, saying that they hadn't seen each other for a long time. The guy wasn't particularly friendly anyway, deciding to keep asking his questions. Why did they come here? Khan decided to respond abruptly, declaring that it was none of his business and did not concern him. Enzi, in turn, replied that they simply dropped by because they were worried about Suha, since some strange guy was hunting her. The guy told them that they would figure this out so they could go back to where they came from. Khan, perplexed, asked if he was really hinting that he should trust them, and that because of them, Suha would be put in danger again and again. Solon was losing control of the words he heard addressed to him because he could not allow himself to hear such nonsense. Enzi abruptly stepped between them and ordered them to stop, as the last thing they needed was a fight near Suha. The guy suggested they maintain good relations. The guy looked at Enzi in bewilderment and asked who they were talking about if he was a vampire. Khan nodded his head and confirmed these words, saying that he was scum, just like those who were vampires. Solon, in response to this, shouted and declared that they were not like them. But Khan was sure that this was only in their eyes, because in the eyes of others, all vampires were the same. The boy was losing his control, but eventually asked if he really thought they had become vampires on a whim. He screamed, saying that they were born in an orphanage and not even that. He doesn't know whether they were born that way or became that way, but they were vampires their entire conscious life. Khan fell silent at this point and decided that there was no point in provoking Solon any further. Even so, the guy started talking about how they grew up in captivity in the Vamfield House orphanage, and the orphanage was only a name, but in fact it was like a prison. The shelter's caretaker monitored their every breath 24/7, and they lived under the strictest supervision in that place. They had never met anyone else, so it took them a long time to discover that they were vampires. Living under surveillance all their lives, they still barely managed to escape from this hell. Khan, having heard their story, lowered his head and did not know how to react to it. Solon stated that sunlight does not affect them the same way as other vampires, and they only drink blood once a year. But more importantly, he clarified that they had nothing to do with the recent murder case because they don't drink human blood. Khan was even more shocked, but Enzi suddenly joined the conversation and stated the facts about the victim. He specified that the girl looked like Suha and was extremely devastated. Enzi assumed that these ghouls were pursuing Suha to kill her, and suddenly Khan interrupted his friend and stated that in the last few years, their relatives had begun to disappear. The guy suggested that this could also be the work of those monsters they dealt with. Enzi, after some thought, decided to state that these guys definitely had some kind of goal. Khan nodded his head and stated that he was sure that the nasty guy would definitely appear again, and they could not allow Suha to be in danger. Solon sighed heavily, agreed with them, but even so stated that this matter did not concern them. Khan suddenly declared that Suha's condition was their concern, causing Solon to almost fall over on the spot. The guy decided to declare that he liked Suha and he would not back down from her. Solon cried out in even greater bewilderment, clearly not intending to know this. But what was even more frightening was the bewildered cry heard from the girl's room. Khan immediately blushed and asked in a trembling voice if she had really heard everything. The girl standing right behind the door asked for forgiveness, saying that she didn't do it on purpose and that it happened by accident. And yet, while she was red as a tomato, she had time to think through the thought of what had happened. On the night of a lunar eclipse, a werewolf falls forever in love with the first person he meets. Just then, Khan's voice pulled her out of her thoughts. The boy asked her to listen to him. He admitted that everything he had just said was the real truth. Unfortunately, or fortunately, werewolves were doomed to love only one person for the rest of their lives. Therefore, Khan declared that he would now be forever tied to her. And only to her. He sheepishly reminded her that there was a nightball competition coming up soon, and he hoped she would be rooting for him. While our heroine stood there and didn't even know what to say in response, the guy apologized for surprising her with such a confession. Soon after this, he decided to say goodbye and go about his business. At that moment, Enzi and Khan began to leave without saying anything to Solon, who stood there in complete bewilderment. The guy wanted to present something, but suddenly Noah contacted him, who was searching for him in horror. He ordered them to run back to their room as quickly as possible. And yet, the guy asked what had happened that was so serious that he was so scared. Noah, horrified, began to talk about how right now, in front of them, stood the caretaker from the orphanage where they grew up. The guy ran through the corridors and couldn't believe that Marge was really here. From the place where they had been living locked up, the Vamfield House shelter, caretaker Marge was here right now. A few moments later, Solon burst inside, looking ahead in bewilderment. The guy stood right behind the woman, who stood quietly and silently. Turning her head, she looked at Solon with the most condemning gaze. Soon after, she looked at the boys again and said in surprise that she now understood where they were. John wanted to ask how she got there, but Marge interrupted him and said that she had something to tell them. Cheyenne immediately screamed and said that they didn't want to hear anything, so she should get out of here right now. And yet, Haley came forward, saying that 120 years had already passed, so they hadn't seen each other for a very long time. He thought she had retreated long ago, but she had been looking for them all this time, so he was curious how she found them. The woman claimed she wasn't actually stalking them. She wondered if she should have told them who she was looking for. Her expression suddenly changed, and she decided that she didn't have time for them anymore anyway, even though it was hard to believe. The woman began to talk about the fact that the thing she was going to tell them now was... Suddenly, a puzzled Solon behind her decided to remind her that she had kept them locked up for over 100 years. He was furious that having appeared after 120 years, she asks to believe her words. Marge yelled at him and reminded him that she hadn't kept him locked up. Suddenly lowering her head, she declared that she could not do otherwise, so it happened that way. Marge shocked them all by saying that she did everything for their own protection. Noah and Jaka, just like Solon, grimaced in anger, not understanding what she was talking about. Helly decided to ask a logical question, asking who she was protecting them from. The woman grimaced and declared that she was protecting them from the original. The boys, naturally, were completely unfamiliar with this name, which is why they asked in bewilderment what it was all about. Marge said that she was talking about Darden, who proclaimed himself the first and from his lesser vampires. To keep them safe from him, she could only lock them in Vamfield House. To make sure the boys understood exactly what was being discussed, the woman added that the point was that the goal of the original and his minions was to kill them. Gino, perplexed, asked Marge what all this meant and who this primordial was. Why would he destroy them anyway? John suddenly shouted at his brothers and told them not to even listen to her, because they couldn't believe what she said. He was more than sure that it was all a lie, and she made it up to trick them into coming back. And yet the woman decided to clarify that they themselves were aware that they were different from other vampires. Marge smirked and asked if they weren't curious about why this was happening. Judging by the shocked looks on the students' faces, the woman decided that the answer was yes. The reason was not that someone turned them or that they were the result of an experiment. It was quite the opposite. The woman stated that these vampires were the original's unfinished projects. Therefore, those monsters are sensitive to sunlight, aggressive, unreasonable, and therefore cannot suppress their thirst for blood. But Marge knew that they were different and that they were the ones who held the ancient power. The woman then shocked them with the news that they were the only ones of their kind. Vampire lords. That's why she hid them, because the lower vampires of the original identified them as their greatest threat and decided to destroy them. The original was once the first human to transform himself into a vampire using forbidden methods. And after that, he began to bite everyone in a row, turning them into his subjects who would serve only him. Although most of those turned were unfinished, lesser vampires. Due to their uncontrollable thirst for blood, the vampires' numbers grew uncontrollably. It was then that the original, using his power over this darkness, attacked the kingdoms. At the moment, as far as she knew, the only ones left alive from the vampire lords were her and them. Marge concluded that this was precisely the reason she hid them at Vamfield House. But if only it were possible, she would prefer that they never knew about the existence of vampires. And yet Solon screamed, saying that this simply couldn't be, because they had spent their entire childhood in an orphanage. The guy didn't understand how everything she said could be true. The woman replied that, being in a critical situation, fighting with the primordial, they decided to save the powers of the ancients. Having sealed all these powers within them, they sent the boys into the distant future. They subsequently lost all their memories and turned into babies. The woman explained that she had been looking for them in all the 19th century orphanages. And after all this, she brought them all to the Vamfield house they had known before. Marge was more than sure that they themselves had probably noticed that they were no longer growing. She explained this by saying that what they are now is their true appearance and that they will not grow old in the future. Gino, although shocked, still decided to assume that everything was so. Then he was interested in why the original had not found them for so many years. The woman replied that all these years the powers of the ancients remained sealed, and the original simply could not detect them. But 17 years ago, something terrible happened to them as their powers began to unleash. Helly instantly realized that if this all happened 17 years ago, then... He immediately remembered Suha's words, who said that before she was born, vampires were nothing more than a story from books. The guy realized that all this coincided with the period when the lesser vampires began to appear. And then, Helly suddenly decided to clarify this with Marge, asking directly what happened 17 years ago. The guy wanted to know exactly why their powers began to be released and what the main reason was. The woman didn't want to hand it all over the place, but she did say that 17 years ago, the princess was reborn. It turned out that the princess had been reborn as a human, and all the seals she had created began to fade. Helly was in incredible shock. John, in turn, shouted again and asked what kind of nonsense she was talking about, and did she really want them to believe in some princess and her reincarnation? In response, Marge stated that if they did not believe, the princess would be in danger, and she no longer had time. Cheyenne suddenly came to his senses and, in bewilderment, asked who this princess was and where she was. The woman replied that the princess was clearly in the school because she felt waves emanating from her. The boy was shocked and couldn't believe that the princess was in their school. Naturally, Helly immediately had an idea that pointed him to only one person. The woman continued to say that, as she had already said earlier, they came not for them, but for her. In the same way, she came to the waves of the princess, because as she grows older, the power of her waves also increases. Marge was more than sure that Darden had also picked up these waves and that it was bad. The stronger the waves become, the more accurately its location can be tracked. At that moment, she turned to Noah, assuming that he was sensitive enough to have felt these waves. Of course, Noah instantly realized who the princess really was. The woman suddenly said that if they had crossed paths with the princess, they would have instinctively sensed her. They had to feel what their purpose was, because that is who they are. The woman repeated herself, saying that they were born to protect the princess. So they were all together. And with her rebirth, the ancient powers contained within them also began to awaken. But at the same time, the Darden waves began to intensify, which did not bode well for them. Having sensed the princess's powers, forgotten for many years, he began to restore his own, and his ultimate goal is to get the princess into his hands. The main reason is that he wants to take possession of the princess's source of powers. The guys immediately remembered how Jaka approached that Chris and asked what he wanted from Suha. That freak just laughed and was surprised that they didn't know anything until now. That's why the boys realized that this scoundrel was Darden. Anger clouded Helly's thoughts. However, Marge finished her thought by saying that Darden wants to get rid of them, because they are the biggest obstacle to his plan. Suddenly, John turned to Helly, surprised, and asked him what he thought. Naturally, the boys weren't sure how to react. The guy also suggested that it looked like some kind of madman's ravings. And yet, for some reason, looking at the woman, they had the feeling that this provided the answer to many questions about the time when they lived in captivity. Noah suddenly chimed in and said that he thought so too. But at the time, the question was about the princess. Helly agreed with Noah without listening to the end, saying that it was 100% about Suha. Suddenly, Noah started talking and turned to the woman, deciding to set the record straight. He decided to admit that all this incomprehensible nonsense was true. But what then did Marge suggest they do? The woman replied that Darden would gradually become stronger, and even now he was regaining his former strength at a terrifying speed. The number of vampires will only increase, but it will be difficult for him to surpass the princess's powers. Before transferring her powers and sending them into the future, the princess gave almost all of her powers to them. That is why the woman said that she was going to take the princess with her and escort her to a safe place. In turn, she ordered them to find Darden and get rid of him once and for all. The guys all shouted in bewilderment and asked what kind of nonsense this was, because they wouldn't give up Suha. The woman suddenly said in surprise that she now knew her name, and in general, she was sure that they were already acquainted with the princess. Cheyenne instantly got goosebumps, realizing how stupid he had done. And yet Marge finished by saying that they all should have been instinctively drawn to her, and it could be said with certainty that she was the princess. The woman asked only one last question. She wanted to know Suha's current location. John immediately screamed and said that they would not even allow her to touch it. The boys couldn't trust the princess to someone they didn't know, to which Marge replied that she was the princess's main governess and had raised her from the cradle. Jaka suddenly looked at the woman in surprise and asked what if she was one of the Darden people. After thinking for a moment, she replied that in that case, she would have initially been focused only on kidnapping the princess, and there would have been no use for her teaching them everything. The woman bowed her head and said that if the princess fell into Darden's hands, then this world would become a living hell. That's why the woman couldn't back down. She was going to do her duty and take her away from here. Haley was principled, because it was no secret to anyone that everything she said could be either true or false. But in any case, he couldn't let her put Suha's life on the line. He decided to remind her that, according to her own words, protecting Suha is their main purpose. As he saw it, she was as much a potential threat to her as Darden. The guy wasn't going to cooperate with her until there was irrefutable evidence of her own words, and until then, she couldn't even get close to Suha. And he immediately warned that if she exposed her to even the slightest danger, he would not let her get away with it. Helly stated that he was no longer the boy she used to know, and that he would be able to fight back against her. After some time, Helly came to Suha to take her to class. The guy did this on his own initiative and hoped that she wouldn't mind. Our heroine was a little embarrassed, but declared that, on the contrary, she was rather in favor. The boys chatted for a bit and continued walking in silence, but it wasn't oppressive. Suha felt comfortable and didn't even know how to describe these feelings inside. Ever since the day he kissed her on the neck, she felt a little awkward being alone with him. And yet, looking at him, she assumed that she was just imagining things. Suddenly, the guy turned his head, causing our heroine to jump. Helly, in turn, thoughtfully asked what she was doing after school today. As soon as he heard the words that she would be home, the guy invited her to come watch the competition. Of course, our heroine was all for it, which is why she happily came to her senses and began nodding her head. Suha said she completely forgot about the tournament at that moment. Helly laughed and asked if she would be rooting for them. The girl also said without thinking that she would be the biggest fan, but she immediately remembered that Khan had come to her door with an offer, which could have changed her decision. However, Healy distracted her with words about how he would try for her. Hearing these words from Helly, our heroine got goosebumps and blushed, which is why she thanked him shyly. Now the girl had no idea what to do because they were both her precious friends. The action shifts to just after classes have ended. The hallways immediately become noisy and bustling. Sua left the classroom realizing that she had been racking her brains the entire lesson, but still hadn't figured out what to do. The girl wanted to decide who she should support when suddenly a voice asked her to stop. Suha began to turn around slowly, assuming that she was being called. Suddenly, she saw Helly in front of her, who joyfully ran up to her and hugged her. He reminded her that she had promised to come and see them, so he wanted to go together. The girl suddenly told him that she thought she heard someone calling her. The guy smiled and began to move her in the other direction, saying that she probably imagined it. At that moment, in the middle of the crowd of students, there stood a woman who was clearly the reason for Suha's questions. Naturally, it was Marge who hoped to take Suha too easily. Helly knew about her desire, but he could not allow it, which is why he threw an aggressive glance in her direction. Meanwhile, the action takes us to the field, where a nightball tournament is in full swing. On one side was the Helly team and all the guys who were determined to win. On the other hand, there was Khan and his guys, who were clearly outnumbered. While both teams' cheering groups were screaming and supporting their favorites, our heroine stood between two fires, not knowing what to do. Tahel laughed and clapped, telling Helly and the others that reaching the finals was quite a good title for them. Noah started laughing and asking if they were really sure they could win with such a lineup. He thought their brothers would join them. Najak responded aggressively to this, saying that only they would be enough for midges like them. John did not agree with these words, so he stated that this year they would win them easily. At this point, Xion was a little distracted as he noticed Suha and couldn't resist starting to shout and wave at her. The guys started shouting loudly, pointing in the other direction, helping to find their fan zone. Xion asked the girl to go there and cheer for them as they worked hard to win. Our heroine was still just as confused and embarrassed and began to say something embarrassedly. Naturally, Khan quickly noticed this scene in which Xion pestered Suha with requests. The guy immediately decided for himself that he would win just for her sake. And yet the boy immediately thought of Mahan, Ruslan, and Camille. If those guys had come, the game would have been decided long ago. A certain resentment and anxiety swirled in his head because the guys had promised to return, but for some reason there was no news from them. In any case, it was too late to think about what had happened to the other team members because the referee was already about to blow the first whistle. All the boys sat opposite each other and waited for the signal, after which a fierce battle would begin for the right to be the best among all the schools. Xion, Gino, John, and others were so determined to win that they didn't even think about giving up. But Khan, along with Najak, Enzi, and Tahel, also looked terrifying because they were ready to fight to the end for one goal. And then finally the whistle blew, after which the ball instantly flew out of the ground and rushed upward. Following this ball, two attackers rushed forward, who were supposed to hit the ball back for their team. Noah proved to be more agile and was able to quickly intercept the ball from Tahel's hands. Tahel was incredibly angry because he didn't want to lose the first serve to such fools. Without thinking twice, Noah passed the ball to John, who was ready to receive the ball. The boy grabbed the ball sharply, pressed it to himself, and started running forward, not even thinking about stopping. But the opponents weren't going to let him through so easily, so the defenders started running towards him. Of course, holding the ball any longer would have been dangerous, so the guy shouted Gino's name and simply passed the ball to him. The guy reacted quickly and intercepted the ball, which meant he was now leading the first round. But John was clearly less lucky, because Najak fell on him with all his weight. One way or another, the guys started to break forward. Xion ran down the right flank and asked for the ball to be passed to him. Gino trusted his brother, so he threw the ball and it hit his brother's hand. It's true that the guy didn't even have time to turn around before he was attacked and thrown to the ground. Our heroine was incredibly scared for Xion's condition, thinking that he could get hurt. At that moment, Enzi praised Khan, took the ball in his hands, and ran forward. Tahel immediately opened up in front of him, asking him to pass the ball to him, and he would finish what he started. Enzi, without thinking twice, threw the ball straight, but he had no idea what awaited him. In the blink of an eye, Helly appeared on the field and masterfully intercepted the ball. Tahel, perplexed, began to say that they needed to act quickly and intercept the ball as soon as possible. However, it was already too late, as Helly began to use his deadly swing. A moment later, it was as if he had fired a sniper rifle and the ball flew through all the defenders. The referee immediately blew his whistle, which meant that the first goal had been scored. All the guys started to rejoice and congratulate Helly, saying that he was an incredible guy. Our heroine was no less delighted with Heli than everyone else, which is why she looked at him with affection. The guy raised his head and, looking into the girl's eyes, smiled, saying that he was glad of her presence. Of course, Suha immediately blushed and didn't even know how to react. But Khan was beside himself with what had happened because they had missed not only the goal, but also Suha, who now admired Heli more than him. One way or another, the next match soon began. The ball flew into the air again, signaling the start of the round. Suddenly, Jaka shouted and said that he would take this ball and pass it to someone. The guy just jumped up. But a moment later, Tahel deftly stole the ball right in front of his nose. Having landed on the ground, Jaka was left with nothing, which meant the game was lost. Tahel rushed forward as if to his main goal, because he saw that there was literally no one ahead. But he began to rejoice too late, because a moment later a face caught up with him. It was Noah who closed Tahel with incredible speed and drove it into a dead end. Tahel was about to resign himself to the loss of his sword, which caused a dissatisfied expression on his face. But a moment later, a beam of light appeared again in the form of Khan, who attacked Noah from behind. A moment later, the boys fell to the ground with a crash, which only meant that the job had been done perfectly. Now the guy was running towards the empty gate again when suddenly he was surrounded again. Solon was getting closer and closer to Tahel, but he was still unable to rush and take the ball. Once again, Tahel could have concluded that this was the end, so he decided to take $1 million chance. The guy jumped to the top. A moment later, he took a powerful swing and threw the ball in a straight trajectory. And soon the scoreboard showed the score 1-1, which only meant that they had managed to equalize it. The guys began to happily grab Tahel for a job well done. At this time, Heli and the other guys were very angry because they did not want to lose their status. And yet soon the bell rang again and another round began. The boys ran around using their different tactics. Throw, pass, and in general, sometimes this helped to overcome the obstacle and move on. But sometimes there was a bigger fish that could knock you down with just one jerk. At this time, our heroine was covered in goosebumps because she was shocked by what she was watching. She herself knew that this whole thing was a competition, but she was literally scared to look at it all. Suha wondered what if someone might get hurt due to the competition when suddenly someone called out to her. The woman in the coat stood there and was quite inconspicuous, but that was not the main thing. The main thing was that she offered to talk to Suha alone. Our heroine was surprised that they approached her, which is why she even decided to ask again if everything was correct. In any case, the girl wanted to know who she was talking to, and in response, the woman said that she needed to say something. Suha wasn't quite sure who it was or why she'd suddenly contacted him. The girl explained that her friends were currently competing on the field. However, the woman only replied that she would wait for her at the main entrance after the first half of the match. It was a very important conversation, so she asked her to attend. Our heroine couldn't even inquire and find out what it was, when suddenly the woman turned around and went about her business. And without a doubt, all this looked too strange for an ordinary person. The score, meanwhile, was 9-9, which made it clear that they were steadily leveling up. With each round, the guys became more and more familiar with the enemy's techniques, which is why they knew how to act in any given situation. At the moment, Jaka was in the lead, holding the ball and making his way deep. The guy swung easily and hit the target, and it was a goal. Once again, the referee announced a goal had been scored, and the boys began congratulating each other, as each goal they scored brought them closer to the main victory. Enzi was breathing heavily, saying that the first half of the match had already passed them by. Khan was very unhappy when he saw that the score was 10-9 not in their favor. He understands that they are barely catching up with the vampires on points, but he didn't even think about the fact that they could lose. The guy proudly decided that there was still the second half left, which meant they had to turn the tide of the game. At that moment, our heroine was thinking that the first half was finally over. Suha suddenly remembered that she had to go to the main gate, and yet she was tormented by questions. What kind of conversation awaited her? Should she go since she didn't even know her? Suddenly, the girl was distracted by an insanely joyful voice calling the girl. It was Cheyenne, who was just beaming with happiness and talking about his goal, hoping that she saw it too. Our heroine happily said that it was really cool and she saw it with her own eyes. However, Solon suddenly appeared and reminded Cheyenne that he had only scored one goal with great difficulty. The guy grumbled and, turning sharply, said that he had scored 2 goals and was not bragging about them left and right. Of course, the guys couldn't help but quarrel while standing next to Suha, because it already looked like some kind of tradition. Soon, Gino also came over and was very happy to see Suha as a support group. The guy suddenly laughed and told the girl that their fan zone with the support group was on the other side, so she could cheer for them from there. The girl clearly didn't want the conversation to go beyond that, but she smiled a little and nodded her head. Suddenly, the girl's voice answered. It was Khan, who had simply decided to say hello to Suha. Naturally, the guys first asked what he was doing there, since this was their zone. Our heroine was stunned at that moment, because she couldn't forget that very confession and the guy's words, which made her feel worse every time. Khan approached Suha and declared that even though they were losing now, they would definitely win in the second part. He was going to make this victory for her sake, so he hoped for her support. Cheyenne suddenly came up to him and asked in bewilderment what he was even doing there, since they had no right to be in their area. Either way, Khan simply ignored everything Cheyenne said. He pointed to the area where their fan zone was located. Our heroine soon began to literally tear herself apart because too much was demanded of her at once. Suddenly, a guy whispered in her ear, asking if she liked this place. Our heroine was horrified and turned around as quickly as possible and was glad to see Helly. Suddenly blushing deeply, the girl began to say that the match was not over yet, so she did not understand how he got there. Smiling, he said that he would soon have to return to the field, so he wished her not to be bored without him. Leaning over her again, he said he just wanted to say something, so he went up to the stands. The guy suggested stepping aside and talking to her about an important topic. Although Suha had no idea what was going on, Helly kept asking her to root for their team. Our heroine didn't understand what was going on, so she decided to ask again what had happened. Suddenly, she jumped up, perplexed that he was doing everything for just one reason. The guy suddenly announced that he was out of time and had to go. A moment later, he jumped over the fence and said goodbye to the girl. Our heroine was thus once again left alone with her thoughts and characters. The girl still wanted to look at Helly, but suddenly remembered the strange woman who was waiting for her at the entrance. Suha clearly remembered that she had promised to talk about something very important. Meanwhile, the referee blew his whistle again, which only meant that the match had begun. The ball was instantly launched into the sky and the boys flew after it, because whoever takes the ball first has a very good advantage. Luckily, Noah was able to intercept the ball and reacted just as quickly and sent it down. A precise pass flew towards Helly, who quickly grabbed the ball and began planning an attack. But only when he raised his head did he see a direct threat before him. Khan literally knocked him to the ground with his body. The guy knew it was a disaster because Khan would take the ball right after that move. Unfortunately for him, that's exactly what happened, because the guy suddenly jumped up, grabbed the ball, and started running towards the goal. But one way or another, Helly was not going to retreat in this war. And so, having risen to his feet, he immediately rushed forward. As if with a snap of his finger, the guy switched to a different mode, in which he began to rapidly catch up with his opponent. After a couple of seconds, they finally caught up, which Khan couldn't help but notice, as he continued to run forward no matter what. Helly instantly turned around and, just like his opponent, grabbed him and began to throw him to the ground. Khan knew he wouldn't have any more opportunities, so he decided to play roulette. The boy clutched the ball tightly, aimed at the goal, and swung his arm just as sharply. At that moment, all the stands fell silent for a moment, when suddenly a loud sound was heard, signaling a goal. Khan was overjoyed because he was able to do what he promised himself and Suha, but it was not the end of the tournament. In any case, the referee started blowing his whistle, and soon the scoreboard showed an equal score of 10 points for each team. The entire Khan team was shocked by what had just happened in this round. While the guys looked angrily at each other, our heroine was asking herself only one question. She didn't want to abandon the game and the boys, but the strange woman still haunted her. What if she was still waiting for her? One way or another, while the girl was lost in thought, the game was not about to end. But on the contrary, another round was beginning. As in all previous games, the one who was able to intercept the ball was in the lead, and the defenders of the other teams ran after him. At that moment, 2 defenders attacked one Helly at the same time. The guy was furious, but despite this, he was not going to stop. With a deft movement, he threw them over himself and also created a throwing window for himself. Without thinking twice, the guy made a deft swing without even aiming at the goal. But he was lucky, and the bell started to ring for a goal. This meant that once again, the vampire team was one step ahead of the werewolves. In the next round, every such step by the vampire team only gave Khan more motivation to win. Suddenly, Helly stood in front of him, not intending to let his opponent through to the gate. But the guy, in turn, was not going to accept this battle, so he decided to bypass it. By throwing the ball into the air, he gave himself the opportunity for a perfect throw, which it was. And again, the score was tied. The audience was extremely tense after such a semifinal. In the next round, the guys could again observe a clear battle between Helly and Khan. However, in many of these skirmishes, Helly remained the winner and ran on. The same thing happened now because he ran to the point from which he began to swing. So the score gradually grew, and even so they continued to go shoulder to shoulder equally. In the next round, Khan was able to take the lead because after a skirmish, he threw his ball into the opponent's goal. A goal. And that meant the score was tied once again. Each round the same scenario was repeated, which even caused the spectators to start joking. But there were few jokes. By the 40th round, Helly could no longer stand still on his feet as he was exhausted. Khan was in the same state, and he was not going to stop because he had only one goal. While the referee was announcing the score, John turned to Helly, asking if he was even alive. John was exhausted, but clearly less so than Helly. He was worried about his brother, who had once again scored a goal on his own. Gino supported John's words, telling his brother that they shouldn't overdo it so much. Helly, in turn, stated that he was fine and that the match itself was coming to an end. The same situation happened with Team Khan, where Enzi was worried about his brother and asked him to be less aggressive in the game. But the guy just couldn't let those upstart vampires take the victory this year either. He was determined to win at any cost, if not for himself and the school. Then for Suha. Once again, the referee announced the start of the round, and at that very second, Helly and Khan rushed towards the ball to get it for their team. Helly had better luck this round. His eyes gleamed with confidence, and his hands held the ball as tightly as possible. A moment later, he took off at incredible speed and began running towards the gate. Khan was in shock, because at times he simply couldn't match Helly, but he couldn't let him go either. The guy understood that they had almost no time, and this only meant that this goal would be decisive. The boy looked at Helly's back and knew only one thing. He had to take the ball. He couldn't lose to them. At that moment, Helly was in a determined mood. He was focused only on the game, the ball, and the goal. But suddenly, hearing the entire rostrum, he seemed not to hear the one single voice he was looking for among everyone. Meanwhile, our heroine nevertheless came out to the woman, apologized for being late, and nevertheless decided to immediately move on to their conversation. Suha felt incredibly uneasy, but she decided to go. She knew she'd quickly hear what the woman had to say and then return. Our heroine repeated herself once again and asked what the woman wanted to talk about, and she only thanked Suha for coming. In any case, she began to prepare her, because what she would say could shock. However, what was even more shocking was the fact that right now a group of bloodthirsty vampires came for their souls. Marge didn't even have time to understand anything when suddenly the monster's paws reached out to her. Our heroine immediately screamed incredibly loudly, because she was the next one to fall into the clutches of the vampires. Meanwhile, Helly had just found and confirmed his worries because Suha's place was empty. The guy instantly became confused and lost focus on the game, not understanding what was happening. He continued to run by inertia, but he felt that something was wrong with the girl. But something wasn't just wrong in the stands. At that moment, Khan started catching up with him. The situation ended up being that Marge and Suha were captured by vampires, and Helly was suddenly overtaken by Khan, who managed to knock him to the ground and intercept him. Khan initially didn't believe he had succeeded, which left him a little confused. And yet, he soon stood up, grabbed the ball, and started running on. The guy was finally able to see the ray of victory, so he was not going to give up. But Jaka, perplexed, turned to Helly and asked what had happened. Without thinking twice, he raised his head and even forgot about the game. Now the only thing that worried him was the absence of the girl in the stands. A moment later, his face changed dramatically because he thought about what could have happened to her, even though he was ridding himself of these bad thoughts. But unfortunately for him, these thoughts would soon be confirmed, because Suha was kidnapped and stolen right from under the entrance. While Helly, as Khan's main opponent, was distracted, he in turn ran as fast as possible from John and Noah. The guy gave it his all, because he knew that this was his last chance to show himself this year. But even so, he felt John and Noah hot on his heels and not letting him get far ahead. Khan didn't even want to accept the possibility that they might lose, because he couldn't allow it. He had to win. At the last moment, when Noah and John jumped towards Khan, he also jumped and began to aim at the gate. A moment later, he made a huge and deft swing, after which the ball flew right into the target, and it was a victory. The judge immediately declared Sunshine City School the winner with a score of 21-20. Khan's team fell all over him and started praising him, saying they couldn't believe it. It was a huge success for their team. At this time, Noah just stood and watched the enemy team who were so jubilant. He, like everyone else, was incredibly tired throughout the game, but still, it was the end. But Haley at this time still stood with a devastated look and did not show any emotions except horror. The boy tried to spot her in the stands, but seeing the empty seat, he knew one thing. Trouble had struck where no one expected it. Suddenly, he shouted the girl's name at the top of his voice, hoping that she would hear him. But it was rather the perplexed Khan who reacted to this, who immediately heard the name of his beloved. The guy directed his gaze to the place where she was sitting, but of course he didn't see anyone. A whole wave of bad thoughts appeared before his eyes, just like Helly's. But at that very moment, without even saying anything, he began to run towards the exit, continuing to shout the girl's name. He knew for sure that she was in the fan zone until the middle of the second half of the match, because he saw her. But then suddenly the girl went somewhere just before the finale, which was unlike her. The guy was trying to understand what could have happened, when suddenly a silhouette appeared before his eyes. He remembered Marge, who had promised them to take the princess with her and protect her. This was a logical reason, and the best one, if one could say so. At this time, the guys did not understand what was going on and why Helly ran after Suha in the other direction. Xian just turned his head, saying that Suha was sitting in the fan zone. But when he looked there, he realized that she wasn't there. All the boys turned their gaze and were instantly horrified. The guy shouted this to the others and said that they should find her as soon as possible. Just at that moment, Helly contacted Noah via telepathic communication to discuss what had happened. Alarmed, Noah immediately responded and asked what was going on and where Suha had gone. Helly stated that this is why he contacted her, because he wanted to find her and he needed Noah's help. The guy immediately said that he would now look for her using echo waves. A moment later, Noah, already alarmed, darkened. His face became much darker. The boys saw their brother's shocked face, so they started asking, perplexed, what happened and where Suha was. The boy suddenly started screaming in horror that he couldn't detect the waves coming from Suha because they had completely disappeared. Helly screamed in even greater horror and asked what it meant, and the boys almost fell to the ground from shock when they learned that Noah could not find her. One way or another, John decided to find out what this could be connected with and why he became so gloomy. The guy immediately started talking about how he even increased the search range, but could not find the outgoing signal from the girl. He then added that there could be two reasons for this. Either she was unconscious or she was no longer alive.